Hi, welcome back to this audiobook. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. This is 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, an underwater tour of the world, by Jules Verne. Video 2, Chapters 6 through 15. Chapter 6. Title: At Full Steam. At this shot the entire crew rushed toward the harpooner commander, officers, mates, sailors, cabin boys, down to engineers leaving their machinery and stokers neglecting their furnaces. The order was given to stop, and the frigate merely coasted. By then the darkness was profound, and as good as the Canadian's eyes were, I still wondered how he could see and what he had seen. My heart was pounding fit to burst. But Ned Land was not mistaken, and we all spotted the object his hand was indicating. 2 cable lengths off the Abraham Lincoln's starboard quarter, the sea seemed to be lit up from underneath. This was no mere phosphorescent phenomenon, that much was unmistakable. Submerged some fathoms below the surface of the water, the monster gave off that very intense but inexplicable glow that several captains had mentioned in their reports. This magnificent radiance had to come from some force with a great illuminating capacity. The edge of its light swept over the sea in an immense, highly elongated oval, condensing at the center into a blazing core whose unbearable glow diminished by degrees outward. "It's only a cluster of phosphorescent particles," exclaimed one of the officers. "No, sir," I answered with conviction. "Not even angel wing clams or salps have ever given off such a powerful light. That glow is basically electric in nature. Besides, look. It's shifting. It's moving back and forth. It's darting at us." A universal shout went up from the frigate. "Quiet!" Commander Farragut said. "Helm hard to leeward. Reverse engines." Sailors rushed to the helm, engineers to their machinery. Under reverse steam immediately, the Abraham Lincoln beat to port, sweeping in a semicircle. "Right your helm! Engines forward!" Commander Farragut called. These orders were executed, and the frigate swiftly retreated from this core of light. My mistake. It wanted to retreat, but the unearthly animal came at us with a speed double our own. We gasped. More stunned than afraid, we stood mute and motionless. The animal caught up with us, played with us. It made a full circle around the frigate then, doing 14 knots, and wrapped us in sheets of electricity that were like luminous dust. Then it retreated 2 or 3 miles, leaving a phosphorescent trail comparable to those swirls of steam that shoot behind the locomotive of an express train. Suddenly, all the way from the dark horizon where it had gone to gather momentum, the monster abruptly dashed toward the Abraham Lincoln with frightening speed, stopped sharply 20 feet from our side plates, and died out, not by diving under the water, since its glow did not recede gradually but all at once, as if the source of this brilliant emanation had suddenly dried up. Then it reappeared on the other side of the ship, either by circling around us or by gliding under our hull. At any instant a collision could have occurred that would have been fatal to us. Meanwhile I was astonished at the frigate's maneuvers. It was fleeing, not fighting. Built to pursue, it was being pursued, and I commented on this to Commander Farragut. His face, ordinarily so emotionless, was stamped with indescribable astonishment. "Professor Aronnax," he answered me, "I don't know what kind of fearsome creature I'm up against, and I don't want my frigate running foolish risks in all this darkness. Besides, how should we attack this unknown creature? How should we defend ourselves against it? Let's wait for daylight, and then we'll play a different role." "You've no further doubts, Commander, as to the nature of this animal?" "No, sir, it's apparently a gigantic narwhal, and an electric one to boot. Maybe," I added, "it's no more approachable than an electric eel or an electric ray." "Right," the commander replied. "And if it has their power to electrocute, it's surely the most dreadful animal ever conceived by our Creator. That's why I'll keep on my guard, sir." The whole crew stayed on their feet all night long. No one even thought of sleeping. Unable to compete with the monster's speed, the Abraham Lincoln slowed down and stayed at half steam. For its part, the narwhal mimicked the frigate, simply rode with the waves, and seemed determined not to forsake the field of battle. However, near midnight it disappeared, or to use a more appropriate expression, it went out, like a huge glowworm. Had it fled from us? We were duty-bound to fear so rather than hope so. But at 12:53 in the morning, a deafening hiss became audible, resembling the sound made by a waterspout expelled with tremendous intensity. By then Commander Farragut, Ned Land, and I were on the afterdeck, peering eagerly into the profound gloom. "Ned Land," the commander asked, "you've often heard whales bellowing?" "Often, sir, but never a whale like this, whose sighting earned me $2,000. Correct, the prize is rightfully yours. But tell me, isn't that the noise cetaceans make when they spurt water from their blowholes?
The very noise, sir, but this one's way louder.
So there can be no mistake. There's definitely a whale lurking in our waters. With your permission, sir, the harpooner added, tomorrow at daybreak we'll have words with it.
If it's in a mood to listen to you, Mr. Land, I replied in a tone far from convinced.
Let me get within 4 harpoon lengths of it, the Canadian shot back, and it had better listen. But to get near it, the commander went on, I'd have to put a whaleboat at your disposal? Certainly, sir. That would be gambling with the lives of my men.
And with my own, the harpooner replied simply.
Near 2 o'clock in the morning, the core of light reappeared, no less intense, 5 miles to windward of the Abraham Lincoln. Despite the distance, despite the noise of wind and sea, we could distinctly hear the fearsome thrashings of the animal's tail, and even its panting breath. Seemingly, the moment this enormous narwhal came up to breathe at the surface of the ocean, air was sucked into its lungs like steam into the huge cylinders of a 2,000 horsepower engine. I said to myself. A cetacean as powerful as a whole cavalry regiment now, that's a whale of a whale. We stayed on the alert until daylight, getting ready for action.
Whaling gear was set up along the railings. Our chief officer loaded the blunderbusses, which can launch harpoons as far as a mile, and long duck guns with exploding bullets that can mortally wound even the most powerful animals. Ned Land was content to sharpen his harpoon, a dreadful weapon, in his hands. At 6 o'clock day began to break, and with the dawn's early light, the narwhal's electric glow disappeared. At 7 o'clock the day was well along, but a very dense morning mist shrank the horizon, and our best spyglasses were unable to pierce it.
The outcome, disappointment and anger.
I hoisted myself up to the crosstrees of the mizzen sail.
Some officers were already perched on the mastheads. At 8 o'clock the mist rolled ponderously over the waves, and its huge curls were lifting little by little. The horizon grew whiter and clearer all at once. Suddenly, just as on the previous evening, Ned Land's voice was audible.
"There's the thing in question, astern to port," the harpooner shouted.
Every eye looked toward the point indicated.
There, a mile and a half from the frigate, a long blackish body emerged a meter above the waves.
Quivering violently, its tail was creating a considerable eddy.
Never had caudal equipment thrashed the sea with such power.
An immense wake of glowing whiteness marked the animal's track, sweeping in a long curve. Our frigate drew nearer to the cetacean. I examined it with a completely open mind.
Those reports from the Shannon and the Helvetia had slightly exaggerated its dimensions, and I put its length at only 250 feet. Its girth was more difficult to judge, but all in all, the animal seemed to be wonderfully proportioned in all 3 dimensions. While I was observing this phenomenal creature, 2 jets of steam and water sprang from its blowholes and rose to an altitude of 40 meters, which settled for me its mode of breathing. From this I finally concluded that it belonged to the branch Vertebrata, class Mammalia, subclass Monodelphia, group Pisciforma, order Cetacea, family, but here I couldn't make up my mind. The order Cetacea consists of 3 families, baleen whales, sperm whales, dolphins, and it's in this last group that narwhals are placed.
Each of these families is divided into several genera, each genus into species, each species into varieties.
So I was still missing variety, species, genus, and family, but no doubt I would complete my classifying with the aid of Heaven and Commander Farragut. The crew were waiting impatiently for orders from their leader.
The latter, after carefully observing the animal, called for his engineer.
The engineer raced over.
"Sir," the commander said, "are you up to pressure?"
"Aye, sir," the engineer replied.
"Fine.
Stoke your furnaces and clap on full steam." 3 cheers greeted this order.
The hour of battle had sounded.
A few moments later, the frigate's 2 funnels vomited torrents of black smoke, and its deck quaked from the trembling of its boilers.
Driven forward by its powerful propeller, the Abraham Lincoln headed straight for the animal.
Unconcerned, the latter let us come within half a cable length, then, not bothering to dive, it got up a little speed, retreated, and was content to keep its distance. This chase dragged on for about 3/4 of an hour without the frigate gaining 2 fathoms on the cetacean.
At this rate, it was obvious that we would never catch up with it.
Infuriated, Commander Farragut kept twisting the thick tuft of hair that flourished below his chin.
"Ned Land," he called. The Canadian reported at once. "Well, Mr. Land," the commander asked, "do you still advise putting my longboats to sea?"
"No, sir," Ned Land replied, "because that beast won't be caught against its will."
"Then what should we do?"
"Stoke up more steam, sir, if you can." As for me, with your permission I'll go perch on the bobstays under the bowsprit, and if we can get within a harpoon length, I'll harpoon the brute." "Go to it, Ned," Commander Farragut replied.
"Engineer," he called, "keep the pressure mounting." Ned Land made his way to his post.
The furnaces were urged into greater activity, our propeller did 43 revolutions per minute, and steam shot from the valves.
Heaving the log, we verified that the Abraham Lincoln was going at the rate of 18.5 miles per hour. But that damned animal also did a speed of 18.5. For the next hour our frigate kept up this pace without gaining a fathom. This was humiliating for one of the fastest racers in the American Navy. The crew were working up into a blind rage. Sailor after sailor heaved insults at the monster, which couldn't be bothered with answering back.
Commander Farragut was no longer content simply to twist his goatee, he chewed on it.
The engineer was summoned once again.
"You're up to maximum pressure?" the commander asked him.
"Aye, sir," the engineer replied.
"And your valves are charged to?"
"To 6.5 atmospheres." "Charge them to 10 atmospheres." A typical American order if I ever heard one.
It would have sounded just fine during some Mississippi paddle wheeler race to outstrip the competition.
"Conseil," I said to my gallant servant, now at my side, "you realize that we'll probably blow ourselves sky high?" "As master wishes," Conseil replied.
"All right, I admit it, I did wish to run this risk." The valves were charged.
More coal was swallowed by the furnaces. Ventilators shot torrents of air over the braziers.
The Abraham Lincoln's speed increased. Its masts trembled down to their blocks, and swirls of smoke could barely squeeze through the narrow funnels.
We heaved the log a second time. "Well, helmsman?" Commander Farragut asked. 19.3 miles per hour, sir." "Keep stoking the furnaces." The engineer did so. The pressure gauge marked 10 atmospheres.
But no doubt the cetacean itself had warmed up, because without the least trouble, it also did 19.3.
What a chase!
No, I can't describe the excitement that shook my very being.
Ned Land stayed at his post, harpoon in hand.
Several times the animal let us approach. "We're overhauling it," the Canadian would shout. Then, just as he was about to strike, the cetacean would steal off with a swiftness I could estimate at no less than 30 miles per hour. And even at our maximum speed, it took the liberty of thumbing its nose at the frigate by running a full circle around us.
A howl of fury burst from every throat.
By noon we were no farther along than at 8 o'clock in the morning. Commander Farragut then decided to use more direct methods.
"Bah," he said. "So that animal is faster than the Abraham Lincoln. All right, we'll see if it can outrun our conical shells. Mate, man the gun in the bow." Our forecastle cannon was immediately loaded and leveled.
The cannoneer fired a shot, but his shell passed some feet above the cetacean, which stayed half a mile off. "Over to somebody with better aim," the commander shouted. "And $500 to the man who can pierce that infernal beast." Kamabai, cool of feature, an old gray-bearded gunner I can see him to this day, approached the cannon, put it in position, and took aim for a good while.
There was a mighty explosion, mingled with cheers from the crew.
The shell reached its target, it hit the animal, but not in the usual fashion. It bounced off that rounded surface and vanished into the sea 2 miles out.
"Oh drat," said the old gunner in his anger. "That rascal must be covered with 6-inch armor plate. Curse the beast." Commander Farragut shouted.
The hunt was on again, and Commander Farragut leaned over to me, saying, "I'll chase that animal till my frigate explodes."
"Yes," I replied, "and nobody would blame you."
We could still hope that the animal would tire out and not be as insensitive to exhaustion as our steam engines. But no such luck.
Hour after hour went by without it showing the least sign of weariness.
However, to the Abraham Lincoln's credit, it must be said that we struggled on with tireless persistence. I estimate that we covered a distance of at least 500 kilometers during this ill-fated day of November 6. But night fell and wrapped the surging ocean in its shadows. By then I thought our expedition had come to an end, that we would never see this fantastic animal again.
I was mistaken.
At 10:50 in the evening, that electric light reappeared 3 miles to windward of the frigate, just as clear and intense as the night before. The narwhal seemed motionless.
Was it asleep perhaps, weary from its workday, just riding with the waves?
This was our chance, and Commander Farragut was determined to take full advantage of it.
He gave his orders.
The Abraham Lincoln stayed at half steam, advancing cautiously so as not to awaken its adversary. In mid-ocean it's not unusual to encounter whales so sound asleep they can successfully be attacked, and Ned Land had harpooned more than one in its slumber. The Canadian went to resume his post on the bobstays under the bowsprit. The frigate approached without making a sound, stopped 2 cable lengths from the animal and coasted.
Not a soul breathed on board. A profound silence reigned over the deck.
We were not 100 feet from the blazing core of light, whose glow grew stronger and dazzled the eyes. Just then, leaning over the forecastle railing, I saw Ned Land below me, one hand grasping the martingale, the other brandishing his dreadful harpoon.
Barely 20 feet separated him from the motionless animal.
All at once his arm shot forward and the harpoon was launched. I heard the weapon collide resonantly, as if it had hit some hard substance. The electric light suddenly went out, and 2 enormous waterspouts crashed onto the deck of the frigate, racing like a torrent from stem to stern, toppling crewmen, breaking spare masts and yardarms from their lashings. A hideous collision occurred, and thrown over the rail with no time to catch hold of it, I was hurled into the sea.
Chapter 7. Title: A Whale of Unknown Species. Although I was startled by this unexpected descent, I at least have a very clear recollection of my sensations during it. At first I was dragged about 20 feet under. I'm a good swimmer, without claiming to equal such other authors as Byron and Edgar Allan Poe, who were master divers, and I didn't lose my head on the way down. With 2 vigorous kicks of the heel, I came back to the surface of the sea. My first concern was to look for the frigate. Had the crew seen me go overboard? Was the Abraham Lincoln tacking about? Would Commander Farragut put a longboat to sea? Could I hope to be rescued?
The gloom was profound. I glimpsed a black mass disappearing eastward, where its running lights were fading out in the distance.
It was the frigate. I felt I was done for. Help! Help! I shouted, swimming desperately toward the Abraham Lincoln. My clothes were weighing me down.
The water glued them to my body, they were paralyzing my movements.
I was sinking. I was suffocating. Help! This was the last shout I gave.
My mouth was filling with water.
I struggled against being dragged into the depths.
Suddenly my clothes were seized by energetic hands, I felt myself pulled abruptly back to the surface of the sea, and yes, I heard these words pronounced in my ear: "If Master would oblige me by leaning on my shoulder, Master will swim with much greater ease."
With one hand I seized the arm of my loyal consile. "You," I said. "You."
"Myself," Consile replied, "and at Master's command."
"That collision threw you overboard along with me?" "Not at all. But being in Master's employ, I followed Master." The fine lad thought this only natural. "What about the frigate?" I asked. "The frigate?" Consile replied, rolling over on his back. "I think Master had best not depend on it to any great extent." "What are you saying?"
"I'm saying that just as I jumped overboard, I heard the men at the helm shout, 'Our propeller and rudder are smashed.'"
"Smashed?" "Yes, smashed by the monster's tusk."
"I believe it's the sole injury the Abraham Lincoln has sustained. But most inconveniently for us, the ship can no longer steer."
"Then we're done for."
"Perhaps," Consile replied serenely.
"However, we still have a few hours before us, and in a few hours one can do a great many things." Consile's unflappable composure cheered me up.
I swam more vigorously, but hampered by clothes that were as restricting as a cloak made of lead, I was managing with only the greatest difficulty.
Consile noticed as much. "Master will allow me to make an incision," he said. And he slipped an open clasp knife under my clothes, slitting them from top to bottom with one swift stroke. Then he briskly undressed me while I swam for us both. I then did Consile the same favor, and we continued to navigate side by side. But our circumstances were no less dreadful. Perhaps they hadn't seen us go overboard, and even if they had, the frigate being undone by its rudder couldn't return to leeward after us. So we could count only on its longboats. Consile had coolly reasoned out this hypothesis and laid his plans accordingly. An amazing character, this boy, in mid-ocean, this stoic lad seemed right at home. So, having concluded that our sole chance for salvation lay in being picked up by the Abraham Lincoln's longboats, we had to take steps to wait for them as long as possible. Consequently, I decided to divide our energies so we wouldn't both be worn out at the same time, and this was the arrangement: while one of us lay on his back, staying motionless with arms crossed and legs outstretched, the other would swim and propel his partner forward. This towing role was to last no longer than 10 minutes, and by relieving each other in this way, we could stay afloat for hours, perhaps even until daybreak.
Slim chance, but hope springs eternal in the human breast. Besides, there were two of us. Lastly, I can vouch as improbable as it seems that even if I had wanted to destroy all my illusions, even if I had been willing to give in to despair, I could not have done so. The cetacean had rammed our frigate at about 11 o'clock in the evening. I therefore calculated on 8 hours of swimming until sunrise. A strenuous task, but feasible, thanks to our relieving each other. The sea was pretty smooth and barely tired us. Sometimes I tried to peer through the dense gloom, which was broken only by the phosphorescent flickers coming from our movements. I stared at the luminous ripples breaking over my hands, shimmering sheets spattered with blotches of bluish gray. It seemed as if we'd plunged into a pool of quicksilver. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, I was overcome with tremendous exhaustion. My limbs stiffened in the grip of intense cramps. Conseil had to keep me going, and attending to our self-preservation became his sole responsibility. I soon heard the poor lad gasping, his breathing became shallow and quick. I didn't think he could stand such exertions for much longer.
Go on. Go on. I told him. Leave master behind, he replied. Never.
I'll drown before he does. Just then, past the fringes of a large cloud that the wind was driving eastward, the moon appeared. The surface of the sea glistened under its rays.
That kindly light rekindled our strength. I held up my head again.
My eyes darted to every point of the horizon.
I spotted the frigate.
It was 5 miles from us and formed no more than a dark, barely perceptible mass.
But as for longboats, not a one in sight. I tried to call out. What was the use at such a distance? My swollen lips wouldn't let a single sound through. Conseil could still articulate a few words, and I heard him repeat at intervals, "Help! Help!"
Ceasing all movement for an instant, we listened. And it may have been a ringing in my ear, from this organ filling with impeded blood, but it seemed to me that Conseil's shout had received an answer back.
"Did you hear that?" I muttered. "Yes, yes." And Conseil hurled another desperate plea into space.
This time there could be no mistake.
A human voice had answered us. Was it the voice of some poor devil left behind in mid-ocean, some other victim of that collision suffered by our ship? Or was it one of the frigate's longboats hailing us out of the gloom?
Conseil made one final effort, and bracing his hands on my shoulders, while I offered resistance with one supreme exertion, he raised himself half out of the water, then fell back exhausted.
"What did you see?"
"I saw," he muttered, "I saw, but we mustn't talk, save our strength."
What had he seen?
Then, Lord knows why, the thought of the monster came into my head for the first time.
But even so, that voice. Gone are the days when Jonas took refuge in the bellies of whales. Nevertheless, Conseil kept towing me.
Sometimes he looked up, stared straight ahead, and shouted a request for directions, which was answered by a voice that was getting closer and closer.
I could barely hear it.
I was at the end of my strength, my fingers gave out, my hands were no help to me, my mouth opened convulsively, filling with brine, its coldness ran through me, I raised my head one last time, then I collapsed.
Just then something hard banged against me. I clung to it.
Then I felt myself being pulled upward, back to the surface of the water, my chest caved in, and I fainted. For certain, I came to quickly, because someone was massaging me so vigorously it left furrows in my flesh.
I half opened my eyes. "Conseil," I muttered. "Did master ring for me?" Conseil replied.
Just then, in the last light of a moon settling on the horizon, I spotted a face that wasn't Conseil's but which I recognized at once.
"Ned!" I exclaimed.
"In person, sir," and still after his prize, the Canadian replied.
"You were thrown overboard after the frigate's collision?"
"Yes, Professor, but I was luckier than you, and right away I was able to set foot on this floating islet."
"Islet? Or in other words, on our gigantic narwhal?"
"Explain yourself, Ned." "It's just that I soon realized why my harpoon got blunted and couldn't puncture its hide."
"Why, Ned, why?" "Because, Professor, this beast is made of boilerplate steel."
At this point in my story, I need to get a grip on myself, reconstruct exactly what I experienced, and make doubly sure of everything I write. The Canadian's last words caused a sudden upheaval in my brain. I swiftly hoisted myself to the summit of this half-submerged creature or object that was serving as our refuge.
I tested it with my foot.
Obviously it was some hard, impenetrable substance, not the soft matter that makes up the bodies of our big marine mammals. But this hard substance could have been a bony carapace, like those that covered some prehistoric animals, and I might have left it at that and classified this monster among such amphibious reptiles as turtles or alligators.
Well, no. The blackish back supporting me was smooth and polished with no overlapping scales.
On impact, it gave off a metallic sonority, and as incredible as this sounds, it seemed, I swear, to be made of riveted plates.
No doubts were possible.
This animal, this monster, this natural phenomenon that had puzzled the whole scientific world, that had muddled and misled the minds of seamen in both hemispheres, was, there could be no escaping it, an even more astonishing phenomenon, a phenomenon made by the hand of man. Even if I had discovered that some fabulous, mythological creature really existed, it wouldn't have given me such a terrific mental jolt. It's easy enough to accept that prodigious things can come from our Creator. But to find, all at once, right before your eyes, that the impossible had been mysteriously achieved by man himself, this staggers the mind. But there was no question now. We were stretched out on the back of some kind of underwater boat that, as far as I could judge, boasted the shape of an immense steel fish.
Ned Land had clear views on the issue. Conseil and I could only line up behind him. But then, I said, does this contraption contain some sort of locomotive mechanism, and a crew to run it?
Apparently, the harpooner replied. And yet for the 3 hours I've lived on this floating island, it hasn't shown a sign of life.
This boat hasn't moved at all? No, Professor Aronnax.
It just rides with the waves, but otherwise it hasn't stirred. But we know that it's certainly gifted with great speed. Now then, since an engine is needed to generate that speed, and a mechanic to run that engine, I conclude, we're saved.
Humph.
Ned Land put in, his tone denoting reservations. Just then, as if to take my side in the argument, a bubbling began astern of this strange submersible whose drive mechanism was obviously a propeller, and the boat started to move. We barely had time to hang on to its topside, which emerged about 80 centimeters above water.
Fortunately, its speed was not excessive.
So long as it navigates horizontally, Ned Land muttered, I've no complaints.
But if it gets the urge to dive, I wouldn't give $2 for my hide.
The Canadian might have quoted a much lower price. So it was imperative to make contact with whatever beings were confined inside the plating of this machine. I searched its surface for an opening or a hatch, a manhole, to use the official term, but the lines of rivets had been firmly driven into the sheet iron joints and were straight and uniform.
Moreover, the moon then disappeared and left us in profound darkness.
We had to wait for daylight to find some way of getting inside this underwater boat. So our salvation lay totally in the hands of the mysterious helmsman steering this submersible, and if it made a dive, we were done for. But aside from this occurring, I didn't doubt the possibility of our making contact with them. In fact, if they didn't produce their own air, they inevitably had to make periodic visits to the surface of the ocean to replenish their oxygen supply. Hence the need for some opening that put the boat's interior in contact with the atmosphere.
As for any hope of being rescued by Commander Farragut, that had to be renounced completely.
We were being swept westward, and I estimate that our comparatively moderate speed reached 12 miles per hour. The propeller churned the waves with mathematical regularity, sometimes emerging above the surface and throwing phosphorescent spray to great heights. Near 4 o'clock in the morning, the submersible picked up speed. We could barely cope with this dizzying rush, and the waves battered us at close range. Fortunately, Ned's hands came across a big mooring ring fastened to the topside of the sheet iron back, and we all held on for dear life. Finally, this long night was over. My imperfect memories won't let me recall my every impression of it. A single detail comes back to me. Several times, during various lulls of wind and sea, I thought I heard indistinct sounds, a sort of elusive harmony produced by distant musical chords. What was the secret behind this underwater navigating, whose explanation the whole world had sought in vain? What beings lived inside this strange boat? What mechanical force allowed it to move about with such prodigious speed? Daylight appeared. The morning mists surrounded us, but they soon broke up. I was about to proceed with a careful examination of the hull, whose topside formed a sort of horizontal platform, when I felt it sinking little by little.
Oh, damnation! Ned Land shouted, stamping his foot on the resonant sheet iron. Open up there, you antisocial navigators!
But it was difficult to make yourself heard above the deafening beats of the propeller. Fortunately, this submerging movement stopped. From inside the boat, there suddenly came noises of iron fastenings pushed roughly aside. One of the steel plates flew up, a man appeared, gave a bizarre yell, and instantly disappeared.
A few moments later, 8 strapping fellows appeared silently, their faces like masks, and dragged us down into their fearsome machine. Chapter 8. Title: Mobilis in Mobili. This brutally executed capture was carried out with lightning speed.
My companions and I had no time to collect ourselves. I don't know how they felt about being shoved inside this aquatic prison, but as for me, I was shivering all over.
With whom were we dealing?
Surely with some new breed of pirates, exploiting the sea after their own fashion. The narrow hatch had barely closed over me when I was surrounded by profound darkness.
Saturated with the outside light, my eyes couldn't make out a thing.
I felt my naked feet clinging to the steps of an iron ladder. Forcibly seized, Ned Land and Conseil were behind me.
At the foot of the ladder, a door opened and instantly closed behind us with a loud clang. We were alone.
Where? I couldn't say, could barely even imagine. All was darkness, but such utter darkness that after several minutes, my eyes were still unable to catch a single one of those hazy gleams that drift through even the blackest nights. Meanwhile, furious at these goings-on, Ned Land gave free rein to his indignation.
"Damnation," he exclaimed. "These people are about as hospitable as the savages of New Caledonia. All that's lacking is for them to be cannibals. I wouldn't be surprised if they were, but believe you me, they won't eat me without my kicking up a protest."
"Calm yourself, Ned my friend," Conseil replied serenely.
"Don't flare up so quickly. We aren't in a kettle yet."
"In a kettle, no," the Canadian shot back, "but in an oven for sure."
"It's dark enough for one. Luckily my bowie knife hasn't left me, and I can still see well enough to put it to use."
"The first one of these bandits who lays a hand on me, don't be so irritable, Ned," I then told the harpooner, "and don't ruin things for us with pointless violence.
Who knows whether they might be listening to us? Instead, let's try to find out where we are." I started moving, groping my way. After 5 steps I encountered an iron wall made of riveted boilerplate.
Then, turning around, I bumped into a wooden table next to which several stools had been set. The floor of this prison lay hidden beneath thick, hempen matting that deadened the sound of footsteps. Its naked walls didn't reveal any trace of a door or window. Going around the opposite way, Conseil met up with me, and we returned to the middle of this cabin, which had to be 20 feet long by 10 wide. As for its height, not even Ned Land, with his great stature, was able to determine it. Half an hour had already gone by without our situation changing, when our eyes were suddenly spirited from utter darkness into blinding light. Our prison lit up all at once, in other words, it filled with luminescent matter so intense that at first I couldn't stand the brightness of it. From its glare and whiteness, I recognized the electric glow that had played around this underwater boat like some magnificent phosphorescent phenomenon. After involuntarily closing my eyes, I reopened them and saw that this luminous force came from a frosted half-globe curving out of the cabin ceiling.
"Finally! It's light enough to see!" Ned Land exclaimed, knife in hand, staying on the defensive. "Yes," I replied, then ventured the opposite view.
"But as for our situation, we're still in the dark."
"Master must learn patience," said the emotionless Conseil.
This sudden illumination of our cabin enabled me to examine its tiniest details. It contained only a table and 5 stools. Its invisible door must have been hermetically sealed. Not a sound reached our ears. Everything seemed dead inside this boat.
Was it in motion, or stationary on the surface of the ocean, or sinking into the depths? I couldn't tell.
But this luminous globe hadn't been turned on without good reason. Consequently, I hoped that some crewman would soon make an appearance.
If you want to consign people to oblivion, you don't light up their dungeons. I was not mistaken. Unlocking noises became audible, a door opened, and 2 men appeared.
One was short and stocky, powerfully muscled, broad-shouldered, robust of limbs, the head squat, the hair black and luxuriant, the mustache heavy, the eyes bright and penetrating, and his whole personality stamped with that southern-blooded zest that, in France, typifies the people of Provence. The philosopher Diderot has very aptly claimed that a man's bearing is the clue to his character, and this stocky little man was certainly a living proof of this claim. You could sense that his everyday conversation must have been packed with such vivid figures of speech as personification, symbolism, and misplaced modifiers. But I was never in a position to verify this because, around me, he used only an odd and utterly incomprehensible dialect. The second stranger deserves a more detailed description. A disciple of such character-judging anatomists as Gratilet or Engel could have read this man's features like an open book. Without hesitation, I identified his dominant qualities: self-confidence, since his head reared like a nobleman's above the arc formed by the lines of his shoulders, and his black eyes gazed with icy assurance; calmness, since his skin, pale rather than ruddy, indicated tranquility of blood; energy, shown by the swiftly knitting muscles of his brow; and finally courage,
since his deep breathing denoted tremendous reserves of vitality.
I might add that this was a man of great pride, that his calm, firm gaze seemed to reflect thinking on an elevated plane, and that the harmony of his facial expressions and bodily movements resulted in an overall effect of unquestionable candor according to the findings of physiognomists, those analysts of facial character. I felt involuntarily reassured in his presence, and this boded well for our interview. Whether this individual was 35 or 50 years of age, I could not precisely state. He was tall, his forehead broad, his nose straight, his mouth clearly etched, his teeth magnificent, his hands refined, tapered, and to use a word from palmistry, highly psychic, in other words, worthy of serving a lofty and passionate spirit. This man was certainly the most wonderful physical specimen I had ever encountered. One unusual detail, his eyes were spaced a little far from each other and could instantly take in nearly a quarter of the horizon. This ability, as I later verified, was strengthened by a range of vision even greater than Ned Land's. When this stranger focused his gaze on an object, his eyebrow lines gathered into a frown, his heavy eyelids closed around his pupils to contract his huge field of vision, and he looked. What a look! As if he could magnify objects shrinking into the distance, as if he could probe your very soul, as if he could pierce those sheets of water so opaque to our eyes and scan the deepest seas. Wearing caps made of sea otter fur, and shod in sealskin fishing boots, these two strangers were dressed in clothing made from some unique fabric that flattered the figure and allowed great freedom of movement. The taller of the two, apparently the leader on board, examined us with the greatest care but without pronouncing a word. Then, turning to his companion, he conversed with him in a language I didn't recognize. It was a sonorous, harmonious, flexible dialect whose vowels seemed to undergo a highly varied accentuation. The other replied with a shake of the head and added 2 or 3 utterly incomprehensible words. Then he seemed to question me directly with a long stare. I replied in clear French that I wasn't familiar with his language, but he didn't seem to understand me, and the situation grew rather baffling. Still, master should tell our story, Conseil said to me. Perhaps these gentlemen will grasp a few words of it. I tried again, telling the tale of our adventures, clearly articulating my every syllable, and not leaving out a single detail. I stated our names and titles, then, in order, I introduced Professor Aronnax, his manservant Conseil, and Mr. Ned Land, harpooner. The man with calm, gentle eyes listened to me serenely, even courteously, and paid remarkable attention. But nothing in his facial expression indicated that he understood my story. When I finished, he didn't pronounce a single word. One resource still left was to speak English. Perhaps they would be familiar with this nearly universal language. But I only knew it, as I did the German language, well enough to read it fluently, not well enough to speak it correctly. Here, however, our overriding need was to make ourselves understood.
Come on, it's your turn, I told the harpooner. Over to you, Mr. Land.
Pull out of your bag of tricks the best English ever spoken by an Anglo-Saxon, and try for a more favorable result than mine. Ned needed no persuading and started our story all over again, most of which I could follow. Its content was the same, but the form differed. Carried away by his volatile temperament, the Canadian put great animation into it. He complained vehemently about being imprisoned in defiance of his civil rights, asked by virtue of which law he was hereby detained, invoked writs of habeas corpus, threatened to press charges against anyone holding him in illegal custody, ranted, gesticulated, shouted, and finally conveyed by an expressive gesture that we were dying of hunger. This was perfectly true, but we had nearly forgotten the fact.
Much to his amazement, the harpooner seemed no more intelligible than I had been. Our visitors didn't bat an eye.
Apparently they were engineers who understood the languages of neither the French physicist Arago nor the English physicist Faraday. Thoroughly baffled after vainly exhausting our philological resources, I no longer knew what tactic to pursue, when Conseil told me, if master will authorize me, I'll tell the whole business in German.
What? You know German? I exclaimed.
Like most Flemish people, with all due respect to master.
On the contrary, my respect is due you. Go to it, my boy.
And Conseil, in his serene voice, described for the third time the various vicissitudes of our story. But despite our narrator's fine accent and stylish turns of phrase, the German language met with no success. Finally, as a last resort, I hauled out everything I could remember from my early school days, and I tried to narrate our adventures in Latin. Cicero would have plugged his ears and sent me to the scullery, but somehow I managed to pull through. With the same negative result. This last attempt ultimately misfiring, the two strangers exchanged a few words in their incomprehensible language and withdrew, not even favoring us with one of those encouraging gestures that are used in every country in the world.
The door closed again. This is outrageous! Ned Land shouted, exploding for the 20th time. I ask you. We speak French, English, German, and Latin to these rogues, and neither of them has the decency to even answer back. Calm down, Ned, I told the seething harpooner. Anger won't get us anywhere. But Professor, our irascible companion went on, can't you see that we could die of hunger in this iron cage? Bah! Conseil put in philosophically. We can hold out a good while yet. My friends, I said, we mustn't despair. We've gotten out of tighter spots. So please do me the favor of waiting a bit before you form your views on the commander and crew of this boat. My views are fully formed, Ned Land shot back. They're rogues. Oh good. And from what country? Roguedom. My gallant Ned, as yet that country isn't clearly marked on maps of the world, but I admit that the nationality of these two strangers is hard to make out. Neither English, French, nor German, that's all we can say. But I'm tempted to think that the commander and his chief officer were born in the low latitudes. There must be southern blood in them. But as to whether they're Spaniards, Turks, Arabs, or East Indians, their physical characteristics don't give me enough to go on. And as for their speech, it's utterly incomprehensible. That's the nuisance in not knowing every language, Conseil replied, or the drawback in not having one universal language. Which would all go out the window. Ned Land replied. Don't you see, these people have a language all to themselves, a language they've invented just to cause despair in decent people who ask for a little dinner. Why, in every country on earth, when you open your mouth, snap your jaws, smack your lips and teeth, isn't that the world's most understandable message? From Quebec to the Tuamotu Islands, from Paris to the Antipodes, doesn't it mean, I'm hungry, give me a bite to eat? Oh, Conseil put in, there are some people so unintelligent by nature. As he was saying these words, the door opened. A steward entered. He brought us some clothes, jackets and sailor's pants, made out of a fabric whose nature I didn't recognize. I hurried to change into them, and my companions followed suit. Meanwhile our silent steward, perhaps a deaf-mute, set the table and laid 3 place settings. There's something serious afoot, Conseil said, and it bodes well. Bah, replied the rancorous harpooner. What the devil do you suppose they eat around here? Turtle livers, loin of shark, dogfish steaks? We'll soon find out. Conseil said. Overlaid with silver dish covers, various platters had been neatly positioned on the tablecloth, and we sat down to eat. Assuredly, we were dealing with civilized people, and if it hadn't been for this electric light flooding over us, I would have thought we were in the dining room of the Hotel Adelphi in Liverpool, or the Grand Hotel in Paris. However, I feel compelled to mention that bread and wine were totally absent. The water was fresh and clear, but it was still water, which wasn't what Ned Land had in mind. Among the foods we were served, I was able to identify various daintily dressed fish, but I couldn't make up my mind about certain otherwise excellent dishes, and I couldn't even tell whether their contents belonged to the vegetable or the animal kingdom. As for the tableware, it was elegant and in perfect taste. Each utensil, spoon, fork, knife, and plate, bore on its reverse a letter encircled by a Latin motto, and here is its exact duplicate, Mobilis and Mobili, and moving within the moving element. It was a highly appropriate motto for this underwater machine, so long as the preposition in is translated as within and not upon. The letter N was no doubt the initial of the name of that mystifying individual in command beneath the seas. Ned and Conseil had no time for such musings. They were wolfing down their food, and without further ado I did the same. By now I felt reassured about our fate, and it seemed obvious that our hosts didn't intend to let us die of starvation. But all earthly things come to an end, all things must pass, even the hunger of people who haven't eaten for 15 hours. Our appetites appeased, we felt an urgent need for sleep. A natural reaction after that interminable night of fighting for our lives. Ye gods, I'll sleep soundly, Conseil said. Me, I'm out like a light. Ned Land replied. My 2 companions lay down on the cabin's carpeting and were soon deep in slumber. As for me, I gave in less readily to this intense need for sleep. Too many thoughts had piled up in my mind, too many insoluble questions had arisen, too many images were keeping my eyelids open. Where were we? What strange power was carrying us along? I felt, or at least I thought I did, the submersible sinking toward the sea's lower strata. Intense nightmares besieged me. In these mysterious marine sanctuaries, I envisioned hosts of unknown animals, and this underwater boat seemed to be a blood relation of theirs, living, breathing, just as fearsome. Then my mind grew calmer, my imagination melted into hazy drowsiness, and I soon fell into an uneasy slumber. Chapter 9. Title: The Tantrums of Ned Land. I have no idea how long this slumber lasted,
but it must have been a good while, since we were completely over our exhaustion.
I was the first one to wake up. My companions weren't yet stirring and still lay in their corners like inanimate objects.
I had barely gotten up from my passably hard mattress when I felt my mind clear, my brain go on the alert.
So I began a careful re-examination of our cell.
Nothing had changed in its interior arrangements.
The prison was still a prison and its prisoners still prisoners.
But, taking advantage of our slumber, the steward had cleared the table. Consequently, nothing indicated any forthcoming improvement in our situation, and I seriously wondered if we were doomed to spend the rest of our lives in this cage. This prospect seemed increasingly painful to me because, even though my brain was clear of its obsessions from the night before, I was feeling an odd short-windedness in my chest.
It was becoming hard for me to breathe.
The heavy air was no longer sufficient for the full play of my lungs. Although our cell was large, we obviously had used up most of the oxygen it contained. In essence, over an hour's time a single human being consumes all the oxygen found in 100 liters of air, at which point that air has become charged with a nearly equal amount of carbon dioxide and is no longer fit for breathing. So it was now urgent to renew the air in our prison, and no doubt the air in this whole underwater boat as well.
Here a question popped into my head. How did the commander of this aquatic residence go about it? Did he obtain air using chemical methods, releasing the oxygen contained in potassium chloride by heating it, meanwhile absorbing the carbon dioxide with potassium hydroxide? If so, he would have to keep up some kind of relationship with the shore, to come by the materials needed for such an operation. Did he simply limit himself to storing the air in high-pressure tanks and then dispense it according to his crew's needs? Perhaps. Or, proceeding in a more convenient, more economical, and consequently more probable fashion, was he satisfied with merely returning to breathe at the surface of the water like a cetacean, renewing his oxygen supply every 24 hours? In any event, whatever his method was, it seemed prudent to me that he used this method without delay. In fact, I had already resorted to speeding up my inhalations in order to extract from the cell what little oxygen it contained, when suddenly I was refreshed by a current of clean air, scented with a salty aroma. It had to be a sea breeze, life-giving, and charged with iodine. I opened my mouth wide, and my lungs glutted themselves on the fresh particles. At the same time, I felt a swaying, a rolling of moderate magnitude, but definitely noticeable. This boat, this sheet iron monster, had obviously just risen to the surface of the ocean, there to breathe in good whale fashion. So the ship's mode of ventilation was finally established. When I had absorbed a chestful of this clean air, I looked for the conduit, the air carrier, if you prefer, that allowed this beneficial influx to reach us, and I soon found it. Above the door opened an air vent that let in a fresh current of oxygen, renewing the thin air in our cell. I had gotten to this point in my observations when Ned and Conseil woke up almost simultaneously, under the influence of this reviving air purification. They rubbed their eyes, stretched their arms, and sprang to their feet. Did Master sleep well? Conseil asked me with his perennial good manners. Extremely well, my gallant lad, I replied. And how about you, Mr. Ned Land? Like a log, Professor. But I must be imagining things, because it seems like I'm breathing a sea breeze.
A seaman couldn't be wrong on this topic, and I told the Canadian what had gone on while he slept.
Good, he said.
That explains perfectly all that bellowing we heard, when our so-called narwhal lay in sight of the Abraham Lincoln.
Perfectly, Mr. Land. It was catching its breath. Only I've no idea what time it is, Professor Aronnax, unless maybe it's dinner time? Dinner time, my fine harpooner? I'd say at least breakfast time, because we've certainly woken up to a new day. Which indicates, Conseil replied, that we've spent 24 hours in slumber. That's my assessment, I replied. I won't argue with you, Ned Land answered. But dinner or breakfast, that steward will be plenty welcome whether he brings the one or the other. The one and the other, Conseil said. Well put, the Canadian replied. We deserve 2 meals, and speaking for myself, I'll do justice to them both. All right, Ned, let's wait and see. I replied. It's clear that these strangers don't intend to let us die of hunger, otherwise last evening's dinner wouldn't make any sense. Unless they're fattening us up. Ned shot back. I object, I replied. We have not fallen into the hands of cannibals. Just because they don't make a habit of it, the Canadian replied in all seriousness, doesn't mean they don't indulge from time to time. Who knows? Maybe these people have gone without fresh meat for a long while, and in that case 3 healthy, well-built specimens like the professor, his manservant, and me get rid of those ideas, Mr. Land, I answered the harpooner. And above all, don't let them lead you to flare up against our hosts,
which would only make our situation worse. Anyhow, the harpooner said, I'm as hungry as all Hades, and dinner or breakfast, not one puny meal has arrived. Mr. Land, I answered, we have to adapt to the schedule on board, and I imagine our stomachs are running ahead of the chief cook's dinner bell. Well then, we'll adjust our stomachs to the chef's timetable.
Conseil replied serenely.
There you go again, Conseil my friend, the impatient Canadian shot back. You never allow yourself any displays of bile or attacks of nerves.
You're everlastingly calm. You'd say your after-meal grace even if you didn't get any food for your before-meal blessing and you'd starve to death rather than complain. What good would it do? Conseil asked. Complaining doesn't have to do good, it just feels good.
And if these pirates, I say pirates out of consideration for the professor's feelings, since he doesn't want us to call them cannibals, if these pirates think they're going to smother me in this cage without hearing what cuss words spice up my outbursts, they've got another thing coming.
Look here, Professor Aronnax, speak frankly. How long do you figure they'll keep us in this iron box? To tell the truth, friend Land, I know little more about it than you do. But in a nutshell, what do you suppose is going on?
My supposition is that sheer chance has made us privy to an important secret. Now then, if the crew of this underwater boat have a personal interest in keeping that secret, and if their personal interest is more important than the lives of 3 men, I believe that our very existence is in jeopardy. If such is not the case, then at the first available opportunity, this monster that has swallowed us will return us to the world inhabited by our own kind.
Unless they recruit us to serve on the crew,
Conseil said, and keep us here till the moment, Ned Land answered, when some frigate that's faster or smarter than the Abraham Lincoln captures this den of buccaneers, then hangs all of us by the neck from the tip of a mainmast yardarm.
Well thought out, Mr. Land, I replied. But as yet, I don't believe we've been tendered any enlistment offers.
Consequently, it's pointless to argue about what tactics we should pursue in such a case. I repeat, let's wait, let's be guided by events, and let's do nothing, since right now there's nothing we can do. On the contrary, Professor, the harpooner replied, not wanting to give in.
There is something we can do. Oh? And what, Mr. Land? Break out of here.
Breaking out of a prison on shore is difficult enough, but with an underwater prison, it strikes me as completely unworkable.
Come now, Ned my friend, Conseil asked, how would you answer Master's objection? I refuse to believe that an American is at the end of his tether.
Visibly baffled, the harpooner said nothing. Under the conditions in which fate had left us, it was absolutely impossible to escape. But a Canadian's wit is half French, and Mr. Ned Land made this clear in his reply.
So, Professor Aronnax, he went on after thinking for a few moments, you haven't figured out what people do when they can't escape from their prison? No, my friend. Easy. They fix things so they stay there.
Of course.
Conseil put in.
Since we're deep in the ocean, being inside this boat is vastly preferable to being above it or below it.
But we fix things by kicking out all the jailers, guards, and wardens, Ned Land added. What's this, Ned? I asked. You'd seriously consider taking over this craft?
Very seriously, the Canadian replied.
It's impossible. And why is that, sir? Some promising opportunity might come up, and I don't see what could stop us from taking advantage of it.
If there are only about 20 men on board this machine, I don't think they can stave off 2 Frenchmen and a Canadian.
It seemed wiser to accept the harpooner's proposition than to debate it.
Accordingly, I was content to reply, let such circumstances come, Mr. Land, and we'll see.
But until then, I beg you to control your impatience. We need to act shrewdly, and your flare-ups won't give rise to any promising opportunities.
So swear to me that you'll accept our situation without throwing a tantrum over it. I give you my word, Professor, Ned Land replied in an unenthusiastic tone. No vehement phrases will leave my mouth, no vicious gestures will give my feelings away, not even when they don't feed us on time.
I have your word, Ned, I answered the Canadian. Then our conversation petered out, and each of us withdrew into his own thoughts.
For my part, despite the harpooner's confident talk, I admit that I entertained no illusions. I had no faith in those promising opportunities that Ned Land mentioned. To operate with such efficiency, this underwater boat had to have a sizable crew, so if it came to a physical contest, we would be facing an overwhelming opponent. Besides, before we could do anything, we had to be free, and that we definitely were not. I didn't see any way out of this sheet iron, hermetically sealed cell. And if the strange commander of this boat did have a secret to keep which seemed rather likely, he would never give us freedom of movement aboard his vessel.
Now then, would he resort to violence in order to be rid of us, or would he drop us off one day on some remote coast? There lay the unknown.
All these hypotheses seemed extremely plausible to me, and to hope for freedom through use of force, you had to be a harpooner.
I realized, moreover, that Ned Land's brooding was getting him madder by the minute.
Little by little, I heard those aforesaid cuss words welling up in the depths of his gullet, and I saw his movements turn threatening again. He stood up, pacing in circles like a wild beast in a cage, striking the walls with his foot and fist. Meanwhile the hours passed, our hunger nagged unmercifully, and this time the steward did not appear. Which amounted to forgetting our castaway status for much too long, if they really had good intentions toward us. Tortured by the growling of his well-built stomach, Ned Land was getting more and more riled, and despite his word of honor, I was in real dread of an explosion when he stood in the presence of one of the men on board. For 2 more hours Ned Land's rage increased. The Canadian shouted and pleaded, but to no avail. The sheet iron walls were deaf. I didn't hear a single sound inside this dead-seeming boat. The vessel hadn't stirred, because I obviously would have felt its hull vibrating under the influence of the propeller. It had undoubtedly sunk into the watery deep and no longer belonged to the outside world. All this dismal silence was terrifying. As for our neglect, our isolation in the depths of this cell, I was afraid to guess at how long it might last. Little by little, hopes I had entertained after our interview with the ship's commander were fading away. The gentleness of the man's gaze, the generosity expressed in his facial features, the nobility of his bearing, all vanished from my memory. I saw this mystifying individual anew for what he inevitably must be, cruel and merciless. I viewed him as outside humanity, beyond all feelings of compassion, the implacable foe of his fellow man, toward whom he must have sworn an undying hate. But even so, was the man going to let us die of starvation, locked up in this cramped prison, exposed to those horrible temptations to which people are driven by extreme hunger? This grim possibility took on a dreadful intensity in my mind, and fired by my imagination, I felt an unreasoning terror run through me. Conseil stayed calm. Ned Land bellowed. Just then a noise was audible outside. Footsteps rang on the metal tiling. The locks were turned, the door opened, the steward appeared. Before I could make a single movement to prevent him, the Canadian rushed at the poor man, threw him down, held him by the throat. The steward was choking in the grip of those powerful hands. Conseil was already trying to loosen the harpooner's hands from his half-suffocated victim, and I had gone to join in the rescue, when I was abruptly nailed to the spot by these words pronounced in French: "Calm down, Mr. Land. And you, Professor, kindly listen to me." Chapter 10. Title: The Man of the Waters. It was the ship's commander who had just spoken. At these words Ned Land stood up quickly. Nearly strangled, the steward staggered out at a signal from his superior, but such was the commander's authority aboard his vessel, not one gesture gave away the resentment that this man must have felt toward the Canadian. In silence we waited for the outcome of this scene. Conseil, in spite of himself, seemed almost fascinated. I was stunned. Arms crossed, leaning against a corner of the table, the commander studied us with great care. Was he reluctant to speak further? Did he regret those words he had just pronounced in French? You would have thought so. After a few moments of silence, which none of us would have dreamed of interrupting, "Gentlemen," he said in a calm, penetrating voice, "I speak French, English, German, and Latin with equal fluency. Hence I could have answered you as early as our initial interview, but first I wanted to make your acquaintance and then think things over. Your 4 versions of the same narrative, perfectly consistent by and large, established your personal identities for me. I now know that sheer chance has placed in my presence Professor Pierre Aronnax, specialist in natural history at the Paris Museum and entrusted with a scientific mission abroad, his manservant Conseil, and Ned Land, a harpooner of Canadian origin aboard the Abraham Lincoln, a frigate in the National Navy of the United States of America." I bowed in agreement. The commander hadn't put a question to me, so no answer was called for. This man expressed himself with perfect ease and without a trace of an accent. His phrasing was clear, his words well chosen, his facility in elocution remarkable. And yet, to me, he didn't have the feel of a fellow countryman. He went on with the conversation as follows: "No doubt, sir, you felt that I waited rather too long before paying you this second visit. After discovering your identities, I wanted to weigh carefully what policy to pursue toward you. I had great difficulty deciding. Some extremely inconvenient circumstances have brought you into the presence of a man who has cut himself off from humanity. Your coming has disrupted my whole existence." "Unintentionally," I said. "Unintentionally," the stranger replied, raising his voice a little.
Was it unintentionally that the Abraham Lincoln hunted me on every sea? Was it unintentionally that you traveled aboard that frigate? Was it unintentionally that your shells bounced off my ship's hull? Was it unintentionally that Mr. Ned Land hit me with his harpoon? I detected a controlled irritation in these words. But there was a perfectly natural reply to these charges, and I made it. Sir, I said, you're surely unaware of the discussions that have taken place in Europe and America with yourself as the subject. You don't realize that various accidents, caused by collisions with your underwater machine, have aroused public passions on those two continents. I'll spare you the innumerable hypotheses with which we've tried to explain this inexplicable phenomenon, whose secret is yours alone. But please understand that the Abraham Lincoln chased you over the Pacific high seas in the belief it was hunting some powerful marine monster, which had to be purged from the ocean at all cost. A half-smile curled the commander's lips, then, in a calmer tone, Professor Aronnax, he replied, do you dare claim that your frigate wouldn't have chased and cannonaded an underwater boat as readily as a monster? This question baffled me, since Commander Farragut would certainly have shown no such hesitation. He would have seen it as his sworn duty to destroy a contrivance of this kind just as promptly as a gigantic narwhal. So you understand, sir, the stranger went on, that I have a right to treat you as my enemy. I kept quiet, with good reason. What was the use of debating such a proposition, when superior force can wipe out the best arguments? It took me a good while to decide, the commander went on. Nothing obliged me to grant you hospitality. If I were to part company with you, I'd have no personal interest in ever seeing you again. I could put you back on the platform of this ship that has served as your refuge. I could sink under the sea, and I could forget you ever existed. Wouldn't that be my right? Perhaps it would be the right of a savage, I replied. But not that of a civilized man. Professor, the commander replied swiftly, I'm not what you term a civilized man. I've severed all ties with society, for reasons that I alone have the right to appreciate. Therefore I obey none of its regulations, and I insist that you never invoke them in front of me. This was plain speaking. A flash of anger and scorn lit up the stranger's eyes, and I glimpsed a fearsome past in this man's life. Not only had he placed himself beyond human laws, he had rendered himself independent, out of all reach, free in the strictest sense of the word. For who would dare chase him to the depths of the sea when he thwarted all attacks on the surface? What ship could withstand a collision with his underwater monitor? What armor plate, no matter how heavy, could bear the thrusts of his spur? No man among men could call him to account for his actions. God, if he believed in him, his conscience if he had one, these were the only judges to whom he was answerable. These thoughts swiftly crossed my mind while this strange individual fell silent, like someone completely self-absorbed. I regarded him with a mixture of fear and fascination, in the same way, no doubt, that Oedipus regarded the Sphinx. After a fairly long silence, the commander went on with our conversation. So I had difficulty deciding, he said. But I concluded that my personal interests could be reconciled with that natural compassion to which every human being has a right. Since fate has brought you here, you'll stay aboard my vessel. You'll be free here, and in exchange for that freedom, moreover totally related to it, I'll lay on you just one condition. Your word that you'll submit to it will be sufficient. Go on, sir, I replied. I assume this condition is one an honest man can accept? Yes, sir. Just this. It's possible that certain unforeseen events may force me to confine you to your cabins for some hours, or even for some days, as the case may be. Since I prefer never to use violence, I expect from you in such a case, even more than in any other, your unquestioning obedience. By acting in this way, I shield you from complicity, I absolve you of all responsibility, since I myself make it impossible for you to see what you aren't meant to see. Do you accept this condition? So things happened on board that were quite odd to say the least, things never to be seen by people not placing themselves beyond society's laws. Among all the surprises the future had in store for me, this would not be the mildest. We accept, I replied. Only, I'll ask your permission, sir, to address a question to you, just one. Go ahead, sir. You said we'd be free aboard your vessel? Completely. Then I would ask what you mean by this freedom. Why, the freedom to come, go, see, and even closely observe everything happening here except under certain rare circumstances, in short, the freedom we ourselves enjoy, my companions and I. It was obvious that we did not understand each other. Pardon me, sir, I went on, but that's merely the freedom that every prisoner has, the freedom to pace his cell. That's not enough for us. Nevertheless, it will have to do. What? We must give up seeing our homeland, friends, and relatives ever again?
Yes, sir. But giving up that intolerable earthly yoke that some men call freedom is perhaps less painful than you think.
By thunder! Ned Land shouted.
I'll never promise I won't try getting out of here. I didn't ask for such a promise, Mr. Land, the commander replied coldly.
Sir, I replied, flaring up in spite of myself, you're taking unfair advantage of us. This is sheer cruelty. No, sir, it's an act of mercy. You're my prisoners of war. I've cared for you when, with a single word, I could plunge you back into the ocean depths. You attacked me. You've just stumbled on a secret no living man must probe, the secret of my entire existence. Do you think I'll send you back to a world that must know nothing more of me? Never. By keeping you on board, it isn't you whom I care for, it's me.
These words indicated that the commander pursued a policy impervious to arguments.
Then, sir, I went on, you give us, quite simply, a choice between life and death? Quite simply. My friends, I said, to a question couched in these terms, our answer can be taken for granted.
But no solemn promises bind us to the commander of this vessel.
None, sir, the stranger replied. Then, in a gentler voice, he went on, now, allow me to finish what I have to tell you. I've heard of you, Professor Aronnax. You, if not your companions, won't perhaps complain too much about the stroke of fate that has brought us together. Among the books that make up my favorite reading, you'll find the work you've published on the great ocean depths. I've pored over it. You've taken your studies as far as terrestrial science can go. But you don't know everything because you haven't seen everything. Let me tell you, Professor, you won't regret the time you spend aboard my vessel. You're going to voyage through a land of wonders. Stunned amazement will probably be your habitual state of mind. It will be a long while before you tire of the sights constantly before your eyes. I'm going to make another underwater tour of the world, perhaps my last, who knows, and I'll review everything I've studied in the depths of these seas that I've crossed so often, and you can be my fellow student. Starting this very day, you'll enter a new element, you'll see what no human being has ever seen before since my men and I no longer count, and thanks to me, you're going to learn the ultimate secrets of our planet. I can't deny it, the commander's words had a tremendous effect on me. He had caught me on my weak side, and I momentarily forgot that not even this sublime experience was worth the loss of my freedom. Besides, I counted on the future to resolve this important question. So I was content to reply, sir, even though you've cut yourself off from humanity, I can see that you haven't disowned all human feeling. We're castaways whom you've charitably taken aboard, we'll never forget that. Speaking for myself, I don't rule out that the interests of science could override even the need for freedom, which promises me that, in exchange, our encounter will provide great rewards. I thought the commander would offer me his hand to seal our agreement. He did nothing of the sort. I regretted that. One last question, I said, just as this inexplicable being seemed ready to withdraw. Ask it, Professor. By what name am I to call you? Sir, the commander replied, to you, I'm simply Captain Nemo. In Latin, Nemo means no one. Ed, to me, you and your companions are simply passengers on the Nautilus. Captain Nemo called out. A steward appeared. The captain gave him his orders in that strange language I couldn't even identify. Then, turning to the Canadian and Conseil, a meal is waiting for you in your cabin, he told them. Kindly follow this man. That's an offer I can't refuse, the harpooner replied. After being confined for over 30 hours, he and Conseil were finally out of this cell. And now, Professor Aronnax, our own breakfast is ready. Allow me to lead the way. Yours to command, Captain. I followed Captain Nemo, and as soon as I passed through the doorway, I went down a kind of electrically lit passageway that resembled a gangway on a ship. After a stretch of some 10 meters, a second door opened before me. I then entered a dining room, decorated and furnished in austere good taste. Inlaid with ebony trim, tall oaken sideboards stood at both ends of this room, and sparkling on their shelves were staggered rows of earthenware, porcelain, and glass of incalculable value. Their silver-plated dinnerware gleamed under rays pouring from light fixtures in the ceiling, whose glare was softened and tempered by delicately painted designs. In the center of this room stood a table, richly spread. Captain Nemo indicated the place I was to occupy. Be seated, he told me, and eat like the famished man you must be. Our breakfast consisted of several dishes whose contents were all supplied by the sea, and some foods whose nature and derivation were unknown to me. They were good, I admit, but with a peculiar flavor to which I would soon grow accustomed. These various food items seemed to be rich in phosphorus, and I thought that they, too, must have been of marine origin. Captain Nemo stared at me. I had asked him nothing,
But he read my thoughts, and on his own he answered the questions I was itching to address him. Most of these dishes are new to you, he told me.
But you can consume them without fear. They're healthy and nourishing.
I renounced terrestrial foods long ago, and I'm none the worse for it.
My crew are strong and full of energy, and they eat what I eat.
So, I said, all these foods are products of the sea? Yes, Professor, the sea supplies all my needs. Sometimes I cast my nets in our wake, and I pull them up ready to burst. Sometimes I go hunting right in the midst of this element that has long seemed so far out of man's reach, and I corner the game that dwells in my underwater forests. Like the flocks of old Proteus, King Neptune's shepherd, my herds graze without fear on the ocean's immense prairies. There I own vast properties that I harvest myself, and which are forever sown by the hand of the Creator of all things. I stared at Captain Nemo in definite astonishment, and I answered him, Sir, I understand perfectly how your nets can furnish excellent fish for your table. I understand less how you can chase aquatic game in your underwater forests, but how a piece of red meat, no matter how small, can figure in your menu, that I don't understand at all.
Nor I, sir, Captain Nemo answered me. I never touch the flesh of land animals.
Nevertheless, this, I went on, pointing to a dish where some slices of loin were still left. What you believe to be red meat, Professor, is nothing other than loin of sea turtle. Similarly, here are some dolphin livers you might mistake for stewed pork. My chef is a skillful food processor who excels at pickling and preserving these various exhibits from the ocean.
Feel free to sample all of these foods.
Here are some preserves of sea cucumber that a Malaysian would declare to be unrivaled in the entire world. Here's cream from milk furnished by the udders of cetaceans, and sugar from the huge fucus plants in the North Sea, and finally, allow me to offer you some marmalade of sea anemone, equal to that from the tastiest fruits. So I sampled away, more as a curiosity seeker than an epicure, while Captain Nemo delighted me with his incredible anecdotes. But this sea, Professor Aronnax, he told me, this prodigious, inexhaustible wet nurse of a sea not only feeds me, she dresses me as well. That fabric covering you was woven from the masses of filaments that anchor certain seashells, as the ancients were wont to do. It was dyed with purple ink from the murex snail and shaded with violet tints that I extract from a marine slug, the Mediterranean sea hare. The perfumes you'll find on the washstand in your cabin were produced from the oozings of marine plants. Your mattress was made from the ocean's softest eelgrass. Your quill pen will be whalebone, Eurinca juice secreted by cuttlefish or squid.
Everything comes to me from the sea, just as someday everything will return to it.
You love the sea, Captain.
Yes, I love it. The sea is the be-all and end-all.
It covers 7/10 of the planet Earth.
Its breath is clean and healthy.
It's an immense wilderness where a man is never lonely, because he feels life astir on every side. The sea is simply the vehicle for a prodigious, unearthly mode of existence. It's simply movement and love, it's living infinity, as one of your poets put it. And in essence, Professor, nature is here made manifest by all three of her kingdoms, mineral, vegetable, and animal. The last of these is amply represented by the 4 zoophyte groups, 3 classes of articulates, 5 classes of mollusks, and 3 vertebrate classes, mammals, reptiles, and those countless legions of fish, an infinite order of animals totaling more than 13,000 species, of which only 1/10 belong to fresh water. The sea is a vast pool of nature. Our globe began with the sea, so to speak, and who can say we won't end with it? Here lies supreme tranquility.
The sea doesn't belong to tyrants.
On its surface, they can still exercise their iniquitous claims, battle each other, devour each other, haul every earthly horror. But 30 feet below sea level, their dominion ceases, their influence fades, their power vanishes.
Ah, sir, live in the heart of the seas. Here alone lies independence. Here I recognize no superiors. Here I'm free.
Captain Nemo suddenly fell silent in the midst of this enthusiastic outpouring. Had he let himself get carried away, past the bounds of his habitual reserve?
Had he said too much? For a few moments he strolled up and down, all aquiver.
Then his nerves grew calmer, his facial features recovered their usual icy composure, and turning to me, "Now, Professor," he said, "if you'd like to inspect the Nautilus, I'm yours to command."
Chapter 11. Title: The Nautilus. Captain Nemo stood up. I followed him.
Contrived at the rear of the dining room, a double door opened, and I entered a room whose dimensions equaled the one I had just left.
It was a library. Tall, black rosewood bookcases, inlaid with copperwork, held on their wide shelves a large number of uniformly bound books.
These furnishings followed the contours of the room, their lower parts leading to huge couches upholstered in maroon leather and curved for maximum comfort. Light, movable reading stands, which could be pushed away or pulled near as desired, allowed books to be positioned on them for easy study. In the center stood a huge table covered with pamphlets, among which some newspapers, long out of date, were visible. Electric light flooded this whole harmonious totality, falling from 4 frosted half-globes set in the scrollwork of the ceiling. I stared in genuine wonderment at this room so ingeniously laid out, and I couldn't believe my eyes. "Captain Nemo," I told my host, who had just stretched out on a couch, "this is a library that would do credit to more than one continental palace, and I truly marvel to think it can go with you into the deepest seas."
"Where could one find greater silence or solitude, Professor?" Captain Nemo replied. "Did your study at the museum afford you such a perfect retreat?"
"No, sir, and I might add that it's quite a humble one next to yours."
"You own 6,000 or 7,000 volumes here."
12,000, Professor Aronnax. "They're my sole remaining ties with dry land. But I was done with the shore the day my Nautilus submerged for the first time under the waters. That day I purchased my last volumes, my last pamphlets, my last newspapers, and ever since I've chosen to believe that humanity no longer thinks or writes. In any event, Professor, these books are at your disposal, and you may use them freely."
I thanked Captain Nemo and approached the shelves of this library.
Written in every language, books on science, ethics, and literature were there in abundance, but I didn't see a single work on economics. They seemed to be strictly banned on board. One odd detail, all these books were shelved indiscriminately without regard to the language in which they were written, and this jumble proved that the Nautilus's captain could read fluently whatever volumes he chanced to pick up. Among these books I noted masterpieces by the greats of ancient and modern times, in other words, all of humanity's finest achievements in history, poetry, fiction, and science, from Homer to Victor Hugo, from Xenophon to Michelet, from Rabelais to Madame George Sand. But science, in particular, represented the major investment of this library. Books on mechanics, ballistics, hydrography, meteorology, geography, geology, etc., held a place there no less important than works on natural history, and I realized that they made up the captain's chief reading. There I saw the complete works of Humboldt, the complete Arago, as well as works by Foucault, Henri St. Clair Deville, Chasles, Milne Edwards, Catterphages, John Tyndall, Faraday, Berthelot, Father Secchi, Petermann, Commander Maury, Louis Agassiz, etc., plus the transactions of France's Academy of Sciences, bulletins from the various geographical societies, etc., and in a prime location, those 2 volumes on the great ocean depths that had perhaps earned me this comparatively charitable
welcome from Captain Nemo.
Among the works of Joseph Bertrand, his book entitled The Founders of Astronomy even gave me a definite date, and since I knew it had appeared in the course of 1865, I concluded that the fitting out of the Nautilus hadn't taken place before then. Accordingly, 3 years ago, at the most, Captain Nemo had begun his underwater existence. Moreover, I hoped some books even more recent would permit me to pinpoint the date precisely, but I had plenty of time to look for them, and I didn't want to put off any longer our stroll through the wonders of the Nautilus. "Sir," I told the captain, "thank you for placing this library at my disposal. There are scientific treasures here, and I'll take advantage of them." "This room isn't only a library," Captain Nemo said, "it's also a smoking room."
"A smoking room?" I exclaimed. "Then one may smoke on board?" "Surely." "In that case, sir, I'm forced to believe that you've kept up relations with Havana."
"None whatever," the captain replied. "Try this cigar, Professor Aronnax, and even though it doesn't come from Havana, it will satisfy you if you're a connoisseur." I took the cigar offered me, whose shape recalled those from Cuba, but it seemed to be made of gold leaf. I lit it at a small brazier supported by an elegant bronze stand, and I inhaled my first whiffs with the relish of a smoker who hasn't had a puff in days.
"It's excellent," I said, "but it's not from the tobacco plant."
"Right," the captain replied, "this tobacco comes from neither Havana nor the Orient. It's a kind of nicotine-rich seaweed that the ocean supplies me, albeit sparingly."
"Do you still miss your Cubans, sir?"
"Captain, I scorn them from this day forward." "Then smoke these cigars whenever you like, without debating their origin. They bear no government seal of approval, but I imagine they're none the worse for it."
"On the contrary."
Just then Captain Nemo opened a door facing the one by which I had entered the library, and I passed into an immense, splendidly lit lounge. It was a huge quadrilateral with canted corners, 10 meters long, 6 wide, 5 high. A luminous ceiling, decorated with delicate arabesques, distributed a soft, clear daylight over all the wonders gathered in this museum. For a museum it truly was, in which clever hands had spared no expense to amass every natural and artistic treasure, displaying them with the helter-skelter picturesqueness that distinguishes a painter's studio. Some 30 pictures by the masters, uniformly framed and separated by gleaming panoplies of arms, adorned walls on which were stretched tapestries of austere design. There I saw canvases of the highest value, the likes of which I had marveled at in private European collections and art exhibitions. The various schools of the old masters were represented by a Raphael Madonna, a Virgin by Leonardo da Vinci, a Nymph by Correggio, a Woman by Titian, an Adoration of the Magi by Veronese, an Assumption of the Virgin by Murillo, a Holbein portrait, a Monk by Velázquez, a Martyr by Ribera, a Village Fair by Rubens, 2 Flemish landscapes by Teniers, 3 little genre paintings by Gerard Dow, Metsu, and Paul Potter, 2 canvases by Géricault and Proudhon, plus seascapes by Bakhuyzen and Vernet. Among the works of modern art were pictures signed by Delacroix, Ingres, Decamps, Troyat, Meissonier, Daubigny, etc., and some wonderful miniature statues in marble or bronze, modeled after antiquity's finest originals, stood on their pedestals in the corners of this magnificent museum.
As the Nautilus's commander had predicted, my mind was already starting to fall into that promised state of stunned amazement.
"Professor," this strange man then said, "you must excuse the informality with which I receive you, and the disorder reigning in this lounge."
"Sir," I replied, "without prying into who you are, might I venture to identify you as an artist?"
"A collector, sir, nothing more. Formerly I loved acquiring these beautiful works created by the hand of man. I sought them greedily, ferreted them out tirelessly, and I've been able to gather some objects of great value.
They're my last mementos of those shores that are now dead for me."
In my eyes, your modern artists are already as old as the ancients. They've existed for 2,000 or 3,000 years, and I mix them up in my mind.
"The masters are ageless. What about these composers?"
I said, pointing to sheet music by Weber, Rossini, Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, Meyerbeer, H. Rold, Wagner, Aubert, Gounod, Victor Mass, and a number of others scattered over a full-size piano organ, which occupied one of the wall panels in this lounge. "These composers," Captain Nemo answered me, "are the contemporaries of Orpheus, because in the annals of the dead, all chronological differences fade, and I'm dead, Professor, quite as dead as those friends of yours sleeping 6 feet under."
Captain Nemo fell silent and seemed lost in reverie.
I regarded him with intense excitement, silently analyzing his strange facial expression. Leaning his elbow on the corner of a valuable mosaic table, he no longer saw me, he had forgotten my very presence. I didn't disturb his meditations, but continued to pass in review the curiosities that enriched this lounge.
After the works of art, natural rarities predominated.
They consisted chiefly of plants, shells, and other exhibits from the ocean that must have been Captain Nemo's own personal finds. In the middle of the lounge, a jet of water, electrically lit, fell back into a basin made from a single giant clam. The delicately festooned rim of the shell, supplied by the biggest mollusk in the class Acephala, measured about 6 meters in circumference, so it was even bigger than those fine giant clams given to King Fran Oisite by the Republic of Venice, and which the Church of Saint Sulpice in Paris has made into 2 gigantic holy water fonts. Around this basin, inside elegant glass cases fastened with copper bands, there were classified and labeled the most valuable marine exhibits ever put before the eyes of a naturalist.
My professorial glee may easily be imagined. The zoophyte branch offered some very unusual specimens from its 2 groups, the polyps and the echinoderms.
In the first group, organ-pipe coral, Gorgonian coral arranged into fan shapes, soft sponges from Syria, Isis coral from the Molucca Islands, sea-pen coral, wonderful coral of the genus Virgularia from the waters of Norway, various coral of the genus Umbellularia, Alcyonarian coral, then a whole series of those madrepores that my mentor Professor Milne Edwards has so shrewdly classified into divisions, and among which I noted the wonderful genus Flabellina as well as the genus Oculina from R. Union Island, plus a Neptune's chariot from the Caribbean Sea, every superb variety of coral, and in short, every species of these unusual polyparies that congregate to form entire islands that will one day turn into continents. Among the echinoderms, notable for being covered with spines, starfish, feather stars, sea lilies, free-swimming crinoids, brittle stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, etc., represented a complete collection of the individuals in this group. An excitable conchologist would surely have fainted dead away before other, more numerous glass cases in which were classified specimens from the mollusk branch. There I saw a collection of incalculable value that I haven't time to describe completely. Among these exhibits I'll mention, just for the record, an elegant royal hammer shell from the Indian Ocean, whose evenly spaced white spots stood out sharply against a base of red and brown, an imperial spiny oyster, brightly colored, bristling with thorns, a specimen rare to European museums, whose value I estimated at 20,000 francs, a common hammer shell from the seas near Queensland, very hard to come by, exotic cockles from Senegal, fragile white bivalve shells that a single breath could pop like a soap bubble, several varieties of watering pot shell from Java, a sort of limestone tube fringed with leafy folds and much fought over by collectors, a whole series of top-shell snails, greenish-yellow ones fished up from American seas, others colored reddish-brown that patronize the waters off Queensland, the former coming from the Gulf of Mexico and notable for their overlapping shells, the latter some sun carrier shells found in the southernmost seas, finally and rarest of all, the magnificent spurred star shell from New Zealand, then some wonderful pepperyfur shells, several valuable species of Cytheric clams and Venus clams, the trellis wentletrap snail from Tranquebar on India's eastern shore, a marbled turban snail gleaming with mother-of-pearl, green parrot shells from the seas of China, the virtually unknown cone snail from the genus Cynodulus, every variety of cowrie used as money in India and Africa, a glory of the seas, the most valuable shell in the East Indies, finally, common periwinkles, delphinula snails, turret snails, violet snails, European cowries, volute snails, olive shells, mitre shells, helmet shells, murex snails, whelks, hark shells, spiky periwinkles, triton snails, horn shells, spindle shells, conch shells, spider conchs, limpets, glass snails, sea butterflies, every kind of delicate, fragile seashell that science has baptized with its most delightful names. Aside and in special compartments, strings of supremely beautiful pearls were spread out, the electric light flecking them with little fiery sparks, pink pearls pulled from saltwater fan shells in the Red Sea, green pearls from the rainbow abalone, yellow, blue, and black pearls, the unusual handiwork of various mollusks from every ocean and of certain mussels from rivers up north, in short, several specimens of incalculable worth that had been oozed by the rarest of shellfish. Some of these pearls were bigger than a pigeon egg, they more than equaled the one that the explorer Tavernier sold the Shah of Persia for 3 million francs, and they surpassed that other pearl owned by the Imam of Muscat, which I had believed to be unrivaled in the entire world. Consequently, to calculate the value of this collection was, I should say, impossible. Captain Nemo must have spent millions in acquiring these different specimens, and I was wondering what financial resources he tapped to satisfy his collector's fancies, when these words interrupted me. "You're examining my shells, Professor?" They're indeed able to fascinate a naturalist, but for me they have an added charm, since I've collected every one of them with my own 2 hands, and not a sea on the globe has escaped my investigations. I understand, Captain, I understand your delight at strolling in the midst of this wealth. You're a man who gathers his treasure in person. No museum in Europe owns such a collection of exhibits from the ocean. But if I exhaust all my wonderment on them, I'll have nothing left for the ship that carries them. I have absolutely no wish to probe those secrets of yours. But I confess that my curiosity is aroused to the limit by this Nautilus, the motor power it contains, the equipment enabling it to operate, the ultra-powerful force that brings it to life. I see some instruments hanging on the walls of this lounge whose purposes are unknown to me. "May I learn, Professor Aronnax?" Captain Nemo answered me. "I've said you'd be free aboard my vessel, so no part of the Nautilus is off limits to you. You may inspect it in detail, and I'll be delighted to act as your guide." "I don't know how to thank you, sir, but I won't abuse your good nature. I would only ask you about the uses intended for these instruments of physical measure, Professor. These same instruments are found in my stateroom, where I'll have the pleasure of explaining their functions to you. But beforehand, come inspect the cabin set aside for you. You need to learn how you'll be lodged aboard the Nautilus." I followed Captain Nemo, who, via one of the doors cut into the lounge's canted corners, led me back down the ship's gangways. He took me to the bow, and there I found not just a cabin but an elegant stateroom with a bed, a washstand, and various other furnishings. I could only thank my host. "Your stateroom adjoins mine," he told me, opening a door, "and mine leads into that lounge we've just left." I entered the captain's stateroom. It had an austere, almost monastic appearance. An iron bedstead, a worktable, some washstand fixtures. Subdued lighting. No luxuries. Just the bare necessities. Captain Nemo showed me to a bench. "Kindly be seated," he told me. I sat, and he began speaking as follows. Chapter 12. Title: Everything Through Electricity. "Sir," Captain Nemo said, showing me the instruments hanging on the walls of his stateroom, "these are the devices needed to navigate the Nautilus. Here, as in the lounge, I always have them before my eyes, and they indicate my position and exact heading in the midst of the ocean. You're familiar with some of them, such as the thermometer, which gives the temperature inside the Nautilus, the barometer, which measures the heaviness of the outside air and forecasts changes in the weather, the humidistat, which indicates the degree of dryness in the atmosphere, the storm glass, whose mixture decomposes to foretell the arrival of tempests, the compass, which steers my course, the sextant, which takes the sun's altitude and tells me my latitude, chronometers, which allow me to calculate my longitude, and finally, spyglasses for both day and night, enabling me to scrutinize every point of the horizon once the Nautilus has risen to the surface of the waves.
These are the normal navigational instruments, I replied, and I'm familiar with their uses.
But no doubt these others answer pressing needs unique to the Nautilus.
That dial I see there, with the needle moving across it, isn't it a pressure gauge?
It is indeed a pressure gauge. It's placed in contact with the water, and it indicates the outside pressure on our hull, which in turn gives me the depth at which my submersible is sitting.
And these are some new breed of sounding line? They're thermometric sounding lines that report water temperatures in the different strata. And these other instruments, whose functions I can't even guess.
Here, Professor, I need to give you some background information, Captain Nemo said.
So kindly hear me out.
He fell silent for some moments, then he said, there's a powerful, obedient, swift, and effortless force that can be bent to any use and which reigns supreme aboard my vessel.
It does everything.
It lights me, it warms me, it's the soul of my mechanical equipment.
This force is electricity. Electricity! I exclaimed in some surprise. Yes, sir.
But, Captain, you have a tremendous speed of movement that doesn't square with the strength of electricity. Until now, its dynamic potential has remained quite limited, capable of producing only small amounts of power. Professor, Captain Nemo replied, my electricity isn't the run-of-the-mill variety, and with your permission, I'll leave it at that. I won't insist, sir, and I'll rest content with simply being flabbergasted at your results. I would ask one question, however, which you needn't answer if it's indiscreet.
The electric cells you use to generate this marvelous force must be depleted very quickly. Their zinc component, for example, how do you replace it, since you no longer stay in contact with the shore?
That question deserves an answer, Captain Nemo replied. First off, I'll mention that at the bottom of the sea there exist veins of zinc, iron, silver, and gold whose mining would quite certainly be feasible. But I've tapped none of these land-based metals, and I wanted to make demands only on the sea itself for the sources of my electricity.
The sea itself?
Yes, Professor, and there was no shortage of such sources. In fact, by establishing a circuit between two wires immersed to different depths, I'd be able to obtain electricity through the diverging temperatures they experience, but I preferred to use a more practical procedure.
And that is?
You're familiar with the composition of salt water. In 1,000 grams one finds 96.5% water and about 2.66% sodium chloride, then small quantities of magnesium chloride, potassium chloride, magnesium bromide, sulfate of magnesia, calcium sulfate, and calcium carbonate. Hence you observe that sodium chloride is encountered there in significant proportions. Now then, it's this sodium that I extract from salt water and with which I compose my electric cells.
Sodium?
Yes, sir. Mixed with mercury, it forms an amalgam that takes the place of zinc in Bunsen cells.
The mercury is never depleted.
Only the sodium is consumed, and the sea itself gives me that. Beyond this, I'll mention that sodium batteries have been found to generate the greater energy, and their electromotor strength is twice that of zinc batteries.
Captain, I fully understand the excellence of sodium under the conditions in which you're placed. The sea contains it. Fine. But it still has to be produced, in short, extracted. And how do you accomplish this?
Obviously your batteries could do the extracting, but if I'm not mistaken, the consumption of sodium needed by your electric equipment would be greater than the quantity you'd extract. It would come about, then, that in the process of producing your sodium, you'd use up more than you'd make. Accordingly, Professor, I don't extract it with batteries, quite simply, I utilize the heat of coal from the earth.
From the earth?
I said, my voice going up on the word. We'll say coal from the seafloor, if you prefer, Captain Nemo replied.
And you can mine these veins of underwater coal? You'll watch me work them, Professor Aronnax. I ask only a little patience of you, since you'll have ample time to be patient.
Just remember one thing, I owe everything to the ocean. It generates electricity, and electricity gives the Nautilus heat, light, motion, and, in a word, life itself.
But not the air you breathe?
Oh, I could produce the air needed on board, but it would be pointless, since I can rise to the surface of the sea whenever I like. However, even though electricity doesn't supply me with breathable air, it at least operates the powerful pumps that store it under pressure in special tanks, which, if need be, allows me to extend my stay in the lower strata for as long as I want.
Captain, I replied, I'll rest content with marveling. You've obviously found what all mankind will surely find one day, the true dynamic power of electricity.
I'm not so certain they'll find it, Captain Nemo replied icily. But be that as it may, you're already familiar with the first use I've found for this valuable force.
It lights us, and with a uniformity and continuity not even possessed by sunlight. Now, look at that clock. It's electric, it runs with an accuracy rivaling the finest chronometers. I've had it divided into 24 hours like Italian clocks, since neither day nor night, sun nor moon, exist for me, but only this artificial light that I import into the depths of the seas. See, right now it's 10 o'clock in the morning. That's perfect. Another use for electricity, the dial hanging before our eyes indicates how fast the Nautilus is going. An electric wire puts it in contact with the patent log. This needle shows me the actual speed of my submersible. And hold on, just now we're proceeding at the moderate pace of 15 miles per hour. It's marvelous, I replied, and I truly see, Captain, how right you are to use this force. It's sure to take the place of wind, water, and steam. But that's not all, Professor Aronnax, Captain Nemo said, standing up. And if you'd care to follow me, we'll inspect the Nautilus's stern. In essence, I was already familiar with the whole forward part of this underwater boat, and here are its exact subdivisions going from amidships to its spur, the dining room, 5 meters long and separated from the library by a watertight bulkhead. In other words, it couldn't be penetrated by the sea. The library, 5 meters long, the main lounge, 10 meters long, separated from the captain's stateroom by a second watertight bulkhead, the aforesaid stateroom, 5 meters long, mine, 2.5 meters long, and finally, air tanks 7.5 meters long and extending to the stem post. Total, a length of 35 meters. Doors were cut into the watertight bulkheads and were shut hermetically by means of India rubber seals, which ensured complete safety aboard the Nautilus in the event of a leak in any one section. I followed Captain Nemo down gangways located for easy transit, and I arrived amidships. There I found a sort of shaft heading upward between two watertight bulkheads. An iron ladder, clamped to the wall, led to the shaft's upper end. I asked the captain what this ladder was for. It goes to the skiff, he replied. What? You have a skiff? I replied in some astonishment. Surely. An excellent longboat, light and unsinkable, which is used for excursions and fishing trips. But when you want to set out, don't you have to return to the surface of the sea? By no means. The skiff is attached to the topside of the Nautilus's hull and is set in a cavity expressly designed to receive it. It's completely decked over, absolutely watertight, and held solidly in place by bolts. This ladder leads to a manhole cut into the Nautilus's hull and corresponding to a comparable hole cut into the side of the skiff. I insert myself through this double opening into the longboat. My crew close up the hole belonging to the Nautilus. I close up the one belonging to the skiff, simply by screwing it into place. I undo the bolts holding the skiff to the submersible, and the longboat rises with prodigious speed to the surface of the sea. I then open the deck paneling, carefully closed until that point. I up mast and hoist sail, or I take out my oars and I go for a spin. But how do you return to the ship? I don't, Professor Aronnax. The Nautilus returns to me. At your command? At my command. An electric wire connects me to the ship. I fire off a telegram, and that's that. Right, I said, tipsy from all these wonders, nothing to it. After passing the well of the companionway that led to the platform, I saw a cabin 2 meters long in which Conseil and Ned Land, enraptured with their meal, were busy devouring it to the last crumb. Then a door opened into the galley, 3 meters long and located between the vessel's huge storage lockers. There, even more powerful and obedient than gas, electricity did most of the cooking. Arriving under the stoves, wires transmitted to platinum griddles a heat that was distributed and sustained with perfect consistency. It also heated a distilling mechanism that, via evaporation, supplied excellent drinking water. Next to this galley was a bathroom, conveniently laid out, with faucets supplying hot or cold water at will. After the galley came the crew's quarters, 5 meters long. But the door was closed and I couldn't see its accommodations, which might have told me the number of men it took to operate the Nautilus. At the far end stood a fourth watertight bulkhead, separating the crew's quarters from the engine room. A door opened, and I stood in the compartment where Captain Nemo, indisputably a world-class engineer, had set up his locomotive equipment. Brightly lit, the engine room measured at least 20 meters in length. It was divided, by function, into two parts. The first contained the cells for generating electricity, the second that mechanism transmitting movement to the propeller. Right off, I detected an odor permeating the compartment that was sui generis. Generis in Latin means, in a class by itself. Captain Nemo noticed the negative impression it made on me. That, he told me, is a gaseous discharge caused by our use of sodium, but it's only a mild inconvenience. In any event, every morning we sanitize the ship by ventilating it in the open air. Meanwhile, I examined the Nautilus's engine with a fascination easy to imagine.
You observe, Captain Nemo told me that I use Bunsen cells, not Ruhmkorff cells.
The latter would be ineffectual. One uses fewer Bunsen cells, but they're big and strong, and experience has proven their superiority.
The electricity generated here makes its way to the stern, where electromagnets of huge size activate a special system of levers and gears that transmit movement to the propeller's shaft. The latter has a diameter of 6 meters, a pitch of 7.5 meters, and can do up to 120 revolutions per minute.
And that gives you
a speed of 50 miles per hour.
There lay a mystery, but I didn't insist on exploring it. How could electricity work with such power? Where did this nearly unlimited energy originate? Was it in the extraordinary voltage obtained from some new kind of induction coil? Could its transmission have been immeasurably increased by some unknown system of levers?
This was the point I couldn't grasp. And sure enough, there's now talk of such a discovery, in which a new set of levers generates considerable power.
Did its inventor meet up with Captain Nemo?
Captain Nemo, I said, I'll vouch for the results and not try to explain them. I've seen the Nautilus at work out in front of the Abraham Lincoln, and I know where I stand on its speed. But it isn't enough just to move, we have to see where we're going. We must be able to steer right or left, up or down. How do you reach the lower depths, where you meet an increasing resistance that's assessed in hundreds of atmospheres? How do you rise back to the surface of the ocean? Finally, how do you keep your ship at whatever level suits you? Am I indiscreet in asking you all these things? Not at all, Professor, the captain answered me after a slight hesitation, since you'll never leave this underwater boat.
Come into the lounge.
It's actually our workroom, and there you'll learn the full story about the Nautilus.
Chapter 13. Title: Some Figures.
A moment later we were seated on a couch in the lounge, cigars between our lips. The captain placed before my eyes a working drawing that gave the ground plan, cross-section, and side view of the Nautilus. Then he began his description as follows: Here, Professor Aronnax, are the different dimensions of this boat now transporting you.
It's a very long cylinder with conical ends.
It noticeably takes the shape of a cigar, a shape already adopted in London for several projects of the same kind. The length of this cylinder from end to end is exactly 70 meters, and its maximum breadth of beam is 8 meters. So it isn't quite built on the 10-to-1 ratio of your high-speed steamers, but its lines are sufficiently long, and they're tapering gradual enough, so that the displaced water easily slips past and poses no obstacle to the ship's movements.
These two dimensions allow you to obtain, via a simple calculation, the surface area and volume of the Nautilus.
Its surface area totals 1,011.45 square meters, its volume 1,507.2 cubic meters, which is tantamount to saying that when it's completely submerged, it displaces 1,500 cubic meters of water, or weighs 1,500 metric tons. In drawing up plans for a ship meant to navigate underwater, I wanted it, when floating on the waves, to lie 9/10 below the surface and to emerge only 1/10. Consequently, under these conditions it needed to displace only 9/10 of its volume, hence 1,356.48 cubic meters. In other words, it was to weigh only that same number of metric tons. So I was obliged not to exceed this weight while building it to the aforesaid dimensions. The Nautilus is made up of two hulls, one inside the other. Between them, joining them together, are iron T-bars that give this ship the utmost rigidity. In fact, thanks to this cellular arrangement, it has the resistance of a stone block, as if it were completely solid. Its plating can't give way, it's self-adhering and not dependent on the tightness of its rivets, and due to the perfect union of its materials, the solidarity of its construction allows it to defy the most violent seas. The two hulls are manufactured from boilerplate steel, whose relative density is 7.8 times that of water. The first hull has a thickness of no less than 5 centimeters and weighs 394.96 metric tons. My second hull, the outer cover, includes a keel 50 centimeters high by 25 wide, which by itself weighs 62 metric tons. This hull, the engine, the ballast, the various accessories and accommodations, plus the bulkheads and interior braces, have a combined weight of 961.52 metric tons, which when added to 394.96 metric tons, gives us the desired total of 1,356.48 metric tons.
Clear? Clear, I replied.
So, the captain went on, when the Nautilus lies on the waves under these conditions, 1/10 of it does emerge above water. Now then, if I provide some ballast tanks equal in capacity to that 1/10, hence able to hold 150.72 metric tons, and if I fill them with water, the boat then displaces 1,507.2 metric tons, or it weighs that much and it would be completely submerged.
That's what comes about, Professor. These ballast tanks exist within easy access in the lower reaches of the Nautilus. I open some stopcocks, the tanks fill, the boat sinks, and it's exactly flush with the surface of the water. Fine, Captain, but now we come to a genuine difficulty. You're able to lie flush with the surface of the ocean, that I understand. But lower down, while diving beneath that surface, isn't your submersible going to encounter a pressure, and consequently undergo an upward thrust, that must be assessed at 1 atmosphere per every 30 feet of water, hence at about 1 kilogram per each square centimeter? Precisely, sir. Then unless you fill up the whole Nautilus, I don't see how you can force it down into the heart of these liquid masses. Professor, Captain Nemo replied, static objects mustn't be confused with dynamic ones, or will be open to serious error. Comparatively little effort is spent in reaching the ocean's lower regions, because all objects have a tendency to become sinkers. Follow my logic here. I'm all ears, Captain. When I wanted to determine what increase in weight the Nautilus needed to be given in order to submerge, I had only to take note of the proportionate reduction in volume that salt water experiences in deeper and deeper strata. That's obvious, I replied. Now then, if water isn't absolutely incompressible, at least it compresses very little. In fact, according to the most recent calculations, this reduction is only 0.0000436 per atmosphere, or per every 30 feet of depth. For instance, to go 1,000 meters down, I must take into account the reduction in volume that occurs under a pressure equivalent to that from a 1,000-meter column of water, in other words, under a pressure of 100 atmospheres. In this instance, the reduction would be 0.00436. Consequently, I'd have to increase my weight from 1,507.2 metric tons to 1,513.77. So the added weight would only be 6.57 metric tons. That's all? That's all, Professor Aronnax, and the calculation is easy to check. Now then, I have supplementary ballast tanks capable of shipping 100 metric tons of water. So I can descend to considerable depths. When I want to rise again and lie flush with the surface, all I have to do is expel that water, and if I desire that the Nautilus emerge above the waves to 1/10 of its total capacity, I empty all the ballast tanks completely. This logic, backed up by figures, left me without a single objection. I accept your calculations, Captain, I replied, and I'd be ill-mannered to dispute them, since your daily experience bears them out. But at this juncture, I have a hunch that we're still left with one real difficulty. What's that, sir? When you're at a depth of 1,000 meters, the Nautilus's plating bears a pressure of 100 atmospheres. If at this point you want to empty the supplementary ballast tanks in order to lighten your boat and rise to the surface, your pumps must overcome that pressure of 100 atmospheres, which is 100 kilograms per each square centimeter. This demands a strength that electricity alone can give me, Captain Nemo said swiftly. Sir, I repeat, the dynamic power of my engines is nearly infinite. The Nautilus's pumps have prodigious strength, as you must have noticed when their waterspouts swept like a torrent over the Abraham Lincoln. Besides, I use my supplementary ballast tanks only to reach an average depth of 1,500 to 2,000 meters, and that with a view to conserving my machinery. Accordingly, when I have a mind to visit the ocean depths 2 or 3 vertical leagues beneath the surface, I use maneuvers that are more time-consuming but no less infallible. What are they, Captain? I asked. Here I'm naturally led into telling you how the Nautilus is maneuvered. I can't wait to find out. In order to steer this boat to port or starboard, in short, to make turns on a horizontal plane, I use an ordinary, wide-bladed rudder that's fastened to the rear of the stern post and worked by a wheel and tackle. But I can also move the Nautilus upward and downward on a vertical plane by the simple method of slanting its 2 fins, which are attached to its sides at its center of flotation. These fins are flexible, able to assume any position, and can be operated from inside by means of powerful levers. If these fins stay parallel with the boat, the latter moves horizontally. If they slant, the Nautilus follows the angle of that slant and, under its propeller's thrust, either sinks on a diagonal as steep as it suits me, or rises on that diagonal. And similarly, if I want to return more swiftly to the surface, I throw the propeller in gear, and the water's pressure makes the Nautilus rise vertically, as an air balloon inflated with hydrogen lifts swiftly into the skies. Bravo, Captain! I exclaimed. But in the midst of the waters, how can your helmsman follow the course you've given him? My helmsman is stationed behind the windows of a pilothouse, which protrudes from the topside of the Nautilus's hull and is fitted with biconvex glass. Is glass capable of resisting such pressures? Perfectly capable. Though fragile on impact, crystal can still offer considerable resistance.
In 1864, during experiments on fishing by electric light in the middle of the North Sea, glass panes less than 7 millimeters thick were seen to resist a pressure of 16 atmospheres, all the while letting through strong, heat-generating rays whose warmth was unevenly distributed. Now then, I use glass windows measuring no less than 21 centimeters at their centers. In other words, they've 30 times the thickness.
Fair enough, Captain, but if we're going to sea, we need light to drive away the dark, and in the midst of the murky waters, I wonder how your helmsman can set astern of the pilothouse is a powerful electric reflector whose rays light up the sea for a distance of half a mile. Oh, bravo! Bravo 3 times over, Captain.
That explains the phosphorescent glow from this so-called narwhal that so puzzled us scientists.
Pertinent to this, I'll ask you if the Nautilus's running afoul of the Scotia, which caused such a great uproar, was the result of an accidental encounter? Entirely accidental, sir.
I was navigating 2 meters beneath the surface of the water when the collision occurred.
However, I could see that it had no dire consequences. None, sir. But as for your encounter with the Abraham Lincoln,
Professor, that troubled me, because it's one of the best ships in the gallant American Navy, but they attacked me and I had to defend myself. All the same, I was content simply to put the frigate in a condition where it could do me no harm. It won't have any difficulty getting repairs at the nearest port.
Ah, Commander, I exclaimed with conviction, your Nautilus is truly a marvelous boat.
Yes, Professor, Captain Nemo replied with genuine excitement, and I love it as if it were my own flesh and blood. Aboard a conventional ship, facing the ocean's perils, danger lurks everywhere. On the surface of the sea, your chief sensation is the constant feeling of an underlying chasm, as the Dutchman Jansen so aptly put it, but below the waves aboard the Nautilus, your heart never fails you. There are no structural deformities to worry about, because the double hull of this boat has the rigidity of iron, no rigging to be worn out by rolling and pitching on the waves, no sails for the wind to carry off, no boilers for steam to burst open, no fires to fear, because this submersible is made of sheet iron not wood, no coal to run out of, since electricity is its mechanical force, no collisions to fear, because it navigates the watery deep all by itself, no storms to brave, because just
a few meters beneath the waves, it finds absolute tranquility.
There, sir. There's the ideal ship. And if it's true that the engineer has more confidence in a craft than the builder, and the builder more than the captain himself, you can understand the utter abandon with which I place my trust in this Nautilus, since I'm its captain, builder, and engineer all in one.
Captain Nemo spoke with winning eloquence.
The fire in his eyes and the passion in his gestures transfigured him. Yes, he loved his ship the same way a father loves his child.
But one question, perhaps indiscreet, naturally popped up, and I couldn't resist asking it. You're an engineer, then, Captain Nemo?
Yes, Professor, he answered me. I studied in London, Paris, and New York back in the days when I was a resident of the Earth's continents.
But how were you able to build this wonderful Nautilus in secret?
Each part of it, Professor Aronnax, came from a different spot on the globe and reached me at a cover address. Its keel was forged by Cruzat in France, its propeller shaft by Penn & Company in London, the sheet iron plates for its hull by Laird's in Liverpool, its propeller by Scott's in Glasgow. Its tanks were manufactured by Kale & Company in Paris, its engine by Krupp in Prussia, its spur by the Motala workshops in Sweden, its precision instruments by Hart Brothers in New York, etc., and each of these suppliers received my specifications under a different name.
But, I went on, once these parts were manufactured, didn't they have to be mounted and adjusted?
Professor, I set up my workshops on a deserted islet in mid-ocean. Our Nautilus was completed by me and my workmen, in other words, by my gallant companions whom I've molded and educated. Then, when the operation was over, we burned every trace of our stay on that islet, which if I could have, I'd have blown up.
From all this, may I assume that such a boat costs a fortune? An iron ship, Professor Aronnax, runs 1,125 francs per metric ton. Now then, the Nautilus has a burden of 1,500 metric tons.
Consequently, it cost 1,687,000 francs, hence 2 million francs including its accommodations, and 4 million or 5 million with all the collections and works of art it contains.
One last question, Captain Nemo.
Ask, Professor.
You're rich, then?
Infinitely rich, sir, and without any trouble, I could pay off the 10 billion franc French national debt. I gaped at the bizarre individual who had just spoken these words.
Was he playing on my credulity? Time would tell. Chapter 14.
Title:
The Black Current.
The part of the planet Earth that the seas occupy has been assessed at 3,832,558 square millimeters, hence more than 38 billion hectares. This liquid mass totals 2,250,000,000 cubic miles and could form a sphere with a diameter of 60 leagues, whose weight would be 3 quintillion metric tons. To appreciate such a number, we should remember that a quintillion is to a billion what a billion is to one. In other words, there are as many billions in a quintillion as ones in a billion. Now then, this liquid mass nearly equals the total amount of water that has poured through all the Earth's rivers for the past 40,000 years. During prehistoric times, an era of fire was followed by an era of water. At first, there was ocean everywhere. Then, during the Silurian period, the tops of mountains gradually appeared above the waves, islands emerged, disappeared beneath temporary floods, rose again, were fused to form continents, and finally the Earth's geography settled into what we have today. Solid matter had wrested from liquid matter some 37,657,000 square miles, hence 12,916,000,000 hectares. The outlines of the continents allow the seas to be divided into 5 major parts: the frozen Arctic and Antarctic Oceans, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean extends north to south between the 2 polar circles and east to west between America and Asia over an expanse of 145 degrees of longitude. It's the most tranquil of the seas, its currents are wide and slow-moving, its tides moderate, its rainfall abundant. And this was the ocean that I was first destined to cross under these strangest of auspices. If you don't mind, Professor, Captain Nemo told me, we'll determine our exact position and fix the starting point of our voyage. It's 15 minutes before noon. I'm going to rise to the surface of the water. The captain pressed an electric bell 3 times. The pumps began to expel water from the ballast tanks. On the pressure gauge, a needle marked the decreasing pressures that indicated the Nautilus's upward progress, then the needle stopped. "Here we are," the captain said. I made my way to the central companionway, which led to the platform. I climbed its metal steps, passed through the open hatches, and arrived topside on the Nautilus. The platform emerged only 80 centimeters above the waves. The Nautilus's bow and stern boasted that spindle-shaped outline that had caused the ship to be compared appropriately to a long cigar. I noted the slight overlap of its sheet iron plates, which resembled the scales covering the bodies of our big land reptiles. So I had a perfectly natural explanation for why, despite the best spyglasses, this boat had always been mistaken for a marine animal. Near the middle of the platform, the skiff was half set in the ship's hull, making a slight bulge. Fore and aft stood 2 cupolas of moderate height, their sides slanting and partly inset with heavy biconvex glass, one reserved for the helmsman steering the Nautilus, the other for the brilliance of the powerful electric beacon lighting his way. The sea was magnificent, the skies clear. This long aquatic vehicle could barely feel the broad undulations of the ocean. A mild breeze out of the east rippled the surface of the water. Free of all mist, the horizon was ideal for taking sights. There was nothing to be seen. Not a reef, not an islet. No more Abraham Lincoln. A deserted immenseness. Raising his sextant, Captain Nemo took the altitude of the sun, which would give him his latitude. He waited for a few minutes until the orb touched the rim of the horizon. While he was taking his sights, he didn't move a muscle, and the instrument couldn't have been steadier in hands made out of marble. "Noon," he said. "Professor, whenever you're ready." I took one last look at the sea, a little yellowish near the landing places of Japan, and I went below again to the main lounge. There the captain fixed his position and used a chronometer to calculate his longitude, which he double-checked against his previous observations of our angles. Then he told me, "Professor Aronnax, we're in longitude 137 degrees 15 minutes west of which meridian?" I asked quickly, hoping the captain's reply might give me a clue to his nationality. "Sir," he answered me, "I have chronometers variously set to the meridians of Paris, Greenwich, and Washington, D.C. But in your honor, I'll use the one for Paris." This reply told me nothing. I bowed, and the commander went on, "We're in longitude 137 degrees 15 minutes west of the meridian of Paris, and latitude 30 degrees 7 minutes north, in other words, about 300 miles from the shores of Japan. At noon on this day of November 8th, we hereby begin our voyage of exploration under the waters. May God be with us." I replied. "And now, Professor," the captain added, "I'll leave you to your intellectual pursuits. I've set our course east-northeast at a depth of 50 meters. Here are some large-scale charts on which you'll be able to follow that course. The lounge is at your disposal, and with your permission, I'll take my leave." Captain Nemo bowed. I was left to myself, lost in my thoughts. They all centered on the Nautilus's commander. Would I ever learn the nationality of this eccentric man who had boasted of having none? His sworn hate for humanity,
a hate that perhaps was bent on some dreadful revenge. What had provoked it? Was he one of those unappreciated scholars, one of those geniuses embittered by the world, as Conseil expressed it, a latter-day Galileo, or maybe one of those men of science, like America's Commander Maury, whose careers were ruined by political revolutions? I couldn't say yet. As for me, whom fate had just brought aboard his vessel, whose life he had held in the balance, he had received me coolly but hospitably. Only, he never took the hand I extended to him. He never extended his own. For an entire hour I was deep in these musings, trying to probe this mystery that fascinated me so. Then my eyes focused on a huge world map displayed on the table, and I put my finger on the very spot where our just determined longitude and latitude intersected. Like the continents, the sea has its rivers. These are exclusive currents that can be identified by their temperature and color, the most remarkable being the one called the Gulf Stream. Science has defined the global paths of 5 chief currents, one in the North Atlantic, a second in the South Atlantic, a third in the North Pacific, a fourth in the South Pacific, and a fifth in the Southern Indian Ocean. Also, it's likely that a sixth current used to exist in the Northern Indian Ocean, when the Caspian and Aral seas joined up with certain large Asian lakes to form a single uniform expanse of water. Now then, at the spot indicated on the world map, one of these seagoing rivers was rolling by, the Kuroshio of the Japanese, the Black Current, heated by perpendicular rays from the tropical sun. It leaves the Bay of Bengal, crosses the Strait of Malacca, goes up the shores of Asia, and curves into the North Pacific as far as the Aleutian Islands, carrying along trunks of camphor trees and other local items, the pure indigo of its warm waters sharply contrasting with the ocean's waves. It was this current the Nautilus was about to cross. I watched it on the map with my eyes, I saw it lose itself in the immenseness of the Pacific, and I felt myself swept along with it, when Ned Land and Conseil appeared in the lounge doorway. My 2 gallant companions stood petrified at the sight of the wonders on display. "Where are we?" the Canadian exclaimed. "In the Quebec Museum?" "Begging master's pardon," Conseil answered, "but this seems more like the Sommerart Artifacts exhibition." "My friends," I replied, signaling them to enter, "you're in neither Canada nor France, but securely aboard the Nautilus, 50 meters below sea level." "If master says so, then so be it," Conseil answered. "But in all honesty, this lounge is enough to astonish even someone Flemish like myself." "Indulge your astonishment, my friend, and have a look, because there's plenty of work here for a classifier of your talents." Conseil needed no encouraging. Bending over the glass cases, the gallant lad was already muttering choice words from the naturalist's vocabulary: class Gastropoda, family Buxonoidea, genus Kauri, species Cyprea madagascariensis, etc. Meanwhile Ned Land, less dedicated to conchology, questioned me about my interview with Captain Nemo. Had I discovered who he was, where he came from, where he was heading, how deep he was taking us? In short, 1,000 questions I had no time to answer. I told him everything I knew, or, rather, everything I didn't know, and I asked him what he had seen or heard on his part. "Haven't seen or heard a thing," the Canadian replied. "I haven't even spotted the crew of this boat. By any chance, could they be electric too?" "Electric? Oh ye gods, I'm half tempted to believe it." "But back to you, Professor Aronnax," Ned Land said, still hanging on to his ideas. "Can't you tell me how many men are on board? 10, 20, 50, 100? I'm unable to answer you, Mr. Land. And trust me on this, for the time being, get rid of these notions of taking over the Nautilus or escaping from it. This boat is a masterpiece of modern technology, and I'd be sorry to have missed it. Many people would welcome the circumstances that have been handed us, just to walk in the midst of these wonders. So keep calm, and let's see what's happening around us." "See," the harpooner exclaimed. "There's nothing to see, nothing we'll ever see from this sheet iron prison. We're simply running around blindfolded." Ned Land was just pronouncing these last words when we were suddenly plunged into darkness, utter darkness. The ceiling lights went out so quickly, my eyes literally ached, just as if we had experienced the opposite sensation of going from the deepest gloom to the brightest sunlight. We stood stock still, not knowing what surprise was waiting for us, whether pleasant or unpleasant. But a sliding sound became audible. You could tell that some panels were shifting over the Nautilus's sides. "It's the beginning of the end," Ned Land said. "Order Hydromedusa," Conseil muttered. Suddenly, through 2 oblong openings, daylight appeared on both sides of the lounge. The liquid masses came into view, brightly lit by the ship's electric outpourings. We were separated from the sea by 2 panes of glass. Initially, I shuddered at the thought that these fragile partitions could break, but strong copper bands secured them, giving them nearly infinite resistance. The sea was clearly visible for a 1-mile radius around the Nautilus. What a sight! What pen could describe it? Who could portray the effects of this light through these translucent sheets of water, the subtlety of its progressive shadings into the ocean's upper and lower strata? The transparency of salt water has long been recognized. Its clarity is believed to exceed that of spring water. The mineral and organic substances it holds in suspension actually increase its translucency. In certain parts of the Caribbean Sea, you can see the sandy bottom with startling distinctness as deep as 145 meters down, and the penetrating power of the sun's rays seems to give out only at a depth of 300 meters. But in this fluid setting traveled by the Nautilus, our electric glow was being generated in the very heart of the waves. It was no longer illuminated water, it was liquid light. If we accept the hypotheses of the microbiologist Ehrenberg, who believes that these underwater depths are lit up by phosphorescent organisms, nature has certainly saved one of her most prodigious sights for residents of the sea, and I could judge for myself from the thousandfold play of the light. On both sides I had windows opening over these unexplored depths. The darkness in the lounge enhanced the brightness outside, and we stared as if this clear glass were the window of an immense aquarium. The Nautilus seemed to be standing still. This was due to the lack of landmarks. But streaks of water, parted by the ship's spur, sometimes threaded before our eyes with extraordinary speed. In wonderment, we leaned on our elbows before these show windows, and our stunned silence remained unbroken until Conseil said, "You wanted to see something, Ned my friend, well, now you have something to see." How unusual, the Canadian put in, setting aside his tantrums and getaway schemes while submitting to this irresistible allure. A man would go an even greater distance just to stare at such a sight. "Ah!" I exclaimed. "I see our captain's way of life. He's found himself a separate world that saves its most astonishing wonders just for him." "But where are the fish?" the Canadian ventured to observe. "I don't see any fish." "Why would you care, Ned my friend?" Conseil replied. "Since you have no knowledge of them." "Me? A fisherman?" Ned Land exclaimed. And on this subject a dispute arose between the two friends, since both were knowledgeable about fish, but from totally different standpoints. Everyone knows that fish make up the fourth and last class in the vertebrate branch. They have been quite aptly defined as cold-blooded vertebrates with a double circulatory system, breathing through gills, and designed to live in water. They consist of two distinct series, the series of bony fish, in other words, those whose spines have vertebrae made of bone, and cartilaginous fish, in other words, those whose spines have vertebrae made of cartilage. Possibly the Canadian was familiar with this distinction, but Conseil knew far more about it, and since he and Ned were now fast friends, he just had to show off. So he told the harpooner, "Ned my friend, you're a slayer of fish, a highly skilled fisherman. You've caught a large number of these fascinating animals. But I'll bet you don't know how they're classified." "Sure I do," the harpooner replied in all seriousness. "They're classified into fish we eat and fish we don't eat." Spoken like a true glutton, Conseil replied. "But tell me, are you familiar with the differences between bony fish and cartilaginous fish?" "Just maybe, Conseil." "And how about the subdivisions of these two large classes?" "I haven't the foggiest notion," the Canadian replied. "All right, listen and learn, Ned my friend. Bony fish are subdivided into 6 orders. Primo, the acanthopterygians, whose upper jaw is fully formed and free-moving, and whose gills take the shape of a comb. This order consists of 15 families, in other words, 3/4 of all known fish. Example, the common perch." "Pretty fair eating," Ned Land replied. "Secundo," Conseil went on, "the abdominals, whose pelvic fins hang under the abdomen to the rear of the pectorals but aren't attached to the shoulder bone, an order that's divided into 5 families and makes up the great majority of freshwater fish. Examples, carp, pike." "Ugh," the Canadian put in with distinct scorn. "You can keep the freshwater fish." "Tertio," Conseil said, "the subbrachians, whose pelvic fins are attached under the pectorals and hang directly from the shoulder bone. This order contains 4 families. Examples, flatfish such as sole, turbot, dab, plaice, brill, etc." "Excellent, really excellent," the harpooner exclaimed, interested in fish only from an edible viewpoint. "Quarto," Conseil went on, unabashed, "the apods, with long bodies that lack pelvic fins and are covered by a heavy, often glutinous skin, an order consisting of only 1 family. Examples, common eels and electric eels." "So, just so." Ned Land replied. "Quinto," Conseil said, "the lophobranchians, which have fully formed, free-moving jaws but whose gills consist of little tufts arranged in pairs along their gill arches. This order includes only 1 family. Examples, seahorses and dragonfish." Bad, very bad, the harpooner replied.
Sexto and last, Conseil said, the plectognaths, whose maxillary bone is firmly attached to the side of the intermaxillary that forms the jaw, and whose palate arch is locked to the skull by sutures that render the jaw immovable, an order lacking true pelvic fins and which consists of two families.
Examples, puffers and moonfish.
They're an insult to a frying pan, the Canadian exclaimed. Are you grasping all this, Ned my friend? Asked the scholarly Conseil. Not a lick of it, Conseil my friend, the harpooner replied.
But keep going, because you fill me with fascination. As for cartilaginous fish, Conseil went on unflappably, they consist of only 3 orders. Good news, Ned put in.
Primo, the cyclostomes, whose jaws are fused into a flexible ring and whose gill openings are simply a large number of holes, an order consisting of only one family.
Example, the lamprey. An acquired taste, Ned Land replied.
Secundo, the cetaceans, with gills resembling those of the cyclostomes but whose lower jaw is free-moving. This order, which is the most important in the class, consists of 2 families.
Examples, the ray and the shark. What? Ned Land exclaimed. Rays and man-eaters in the same order?
Well, Conseil my friend, on behalf of the rays, I wouldn't advise you to put them in the same fish tank.
Tertio, Conseil replied, the sturionians, whose gill opening is the usual single slit adorned with a gill cover, an order consisting of 4 genera.
Example, the sturgeon. Ah, Conseil my friend, you saved the best for last, in my opinion anyhow.
And that's all of them?
Yes, my gallant Ned, Conseil replied. And note well, even when one has grasped all this, one still knows next to nothing, because these families are subdivided into genera, subgenera, species, varieties. All right, Conseil my friend, the harpooner said, leaning toward the glass panel, here come a couple of your varieties now.
Yes. Fish. Conseil exclaimed. One would think he was in front of an aquarium.
No, I replied, because an aquarium is nothing more than a cage, and these fish are as free as birds in the air.
Well, Conseil my friend, identify them. Start naming them. Ned Land exclaimed. Me? Conseil replied. I'm unable to. That's my employer's bailiwick.
And in truth, although the fine lad was a classifying maniac, he was no naturalist, and I doubt that he could tell a bonito from a tuna. In short, he was the exact opposite of the Canadian, who knew nothing about classification but could instantly put a name to any fish.
A triggerfish, I said. It's a Chinese triggerfish, Ned Land replied. Genus Bolistes, family Scleroderma, order Plectognatha, Conseil muttered.
Assuredly, Ned and Conseil in combination added up to one outstanding naturalist. The Canadian was not mistaken. Cavorting around the Nautilus was a school of triggerfish with flat bodies, grainy skins, armed with stings on their dorsal fins, and with 4 prickly rows of quills quivering on both sides of their tails. Nothing could have been more wonderful than the skin covering them, white underneath, gray above, with spots of gold sparkling in the dark eddies of the waves. Around them, rays were undulating like sheets flapping in the wind, and among these I spotted, much to my glee, a Chinese ray, yellowish on its topside, a dainty pink on its belly, and armed with 3 stings behind its eyes, a rare species whose very existence was still doubted in lac Timidisdae, since that pioneering classifier of fish had seen one only in a portfolio of Japanese drawings. For 2 hours a whole aquatic army escorted the Nautilus. In the midst of their leaping and cavorting, while they competed with each other in beauty, radiance, and speed, I could distinguish some green wrasse, bewhiskered mullet marked with pairs of black lines, white gobies from the genus Eleotris with curved caudal fins and violet spots on the back, wonderful Japanese mackerel from the genus Scomber with blue bodies and silver heads, glittering azure goldfish whose name by itself gives their full description, several varieties of porgy or gilthead. Some banded gilthead with fins variously blue and yellow, some with horizontal heraldic bars and enhanced by a black strip around their caudal area, some with color zones and elegantly corseted in their 6 waistbands, trumpetfish with flute-like beaks that looked like genuine seafaring woodcocks and were sometimes a meter long, Japanese salamanders, serpentine moray eels from the genus Echidna that were 6 feet long with sharp little eyes and a huge mouth bristling with teeth, etc. Our wonderment stayed at an all-time fever pitch. Our exclamations were endless. Ned identified the fish, Conseil classified them, and as for me, I was in ecstasy over the verve of their movements and the beauty of their forms. Never before had I been given the chance to glimpse these animals alive and at large in their native element. Given such a complete collection from the seas of Japan and China, I won't mention every variety that passed before our dazzled eyes. More numerous than birds in the air, these fish raced right up to us, no doubt attracted by the brilliant glow of our electric beacon. Suddenly daylight appeared in the lounge. The sheet iron panels slid shut. The magical vision disappeared. But for a good while I kept dreaming away, until the moment my eyes focused on the instruments hanging on the wall. The compass still showed our heading as east-northeast, the pressure gauge indicated a pressure of 5 atmospheres, corresponding to a depth of 50 meters, and the electric log gave our speed as 15 miles per hour. I waited for Captain Nemo. But he didn't appear. The clock marked the hour of 5. Ned Land and Conseil returned to their cabin. As for me, I repaired to my stateroom. There I found dinner ready for me. It consisted of turtle soup made from the daintiest hawksbill, a red mullet with white, slightly flaky flesh, whose liver, when separately prepared, makes delicious eating, plus one of imperial angelfish, whose flavor struck me as even better than salmon. I spent the evening in reading, writing, and thinking. Then drowsiness overtook me, I stretched out on my eelgrass mattress, and I fell into a deep slumber, while the Nautilus glided through the swiftly flowing black current.
Chapter 15. Title: An Invitation in Writing.
The next day, November 9th, I woke up only after a long, 12-hour slumber. Conseil, a creature of habit, came to ask how Master's night went, and to offer his services. He had left his Canadian friend sleeping like a man who had never done anything else. I let the gallant lad babble as he pleased, without giving him much in the way of a reply. I was concerned about Captain Nemo's absence during our session the previous afternoon, and I hoped to see him again today. Soon I had put on my clothes, which were woven from strands of seashell tissue. More than once their composition provoked comments from Conseil. I informed him that they were made from the smooth, silken filaments with which the fan mussel, a type of seashell quite abundant along Mediterranean beaches, attaches itself to rocks. In olden times, fine fabrics, stockings, and gloves were made from such filaments, because they were both very soft and very warm. So the Nautilus's crew could dress themselves at little cost, without needing a thing from cotton growers, sheep, or silkworms on shore. As soon as I was dressed, I made my way to the main lounge. It was deserted. I dove into studying the conchological treasures amassed inside the glass cases. I also investigated the huge plant albums that were filled with the rarest marine herbs, which, although they were pressed and dried, still kept their wonderful colors. Among these valuable water plants, I noted various seaweed, some Cladostophus verticillatus, peacock's tails, fig-leafed caulerpa, grain-bearing beauty bushes, delicate rose-tangle tinted scarlet, sea colander arranged into fan shapes, mermaid's cups that look like the caps of squat mushrooms and for years had been classified among the zoophytes, in short, a complete series of algae. The entire day passed without my being honored by a visit from Captain Nemo.
The panels in the lounge didn't open.
Perhaps they didn't want us to get tired of these beautiful things.
The Nautilus kept to an east-northeasterly heading, a speed of 12 miles per hour, and a depth between 50 and 60 meters. Next day, November 10th, the same neglect, the same solitude. I didn't see a soul from the crew. Ned and Conseil spent the better part of the day with me. They were astonished at the captain's inexplicable absence. Was this eccentric man ill? Did he want to change his plans concerning us? But after all, as Conseil noted, we enjoyed complete freedom, we were daintily and abundantly fed.
Our host had kept to the terms of his agreement. We couldn't complain, and moreover, the very uniqueness of our situation had such generous rewards in store for us, we had no grounds for criticism. That day I started my diary of these adventures, which has enabled me to narrate them with the most scrupulous accuracy, and one odd detail, I wrote it on paper manufactured from marine eelgrass. Early in the morning on November 11th, fresh air poured through the Nautilus's interior, informing me that we had returned to the surface of the ocean to renew our oxygen supply. I headed for the central companionway and climbed onto the platform. It was 6 o'clock. I found the weather overcast, the sea gray but calm.
Hardly a billow. I hoped to encounter Captain Nemo there. Would he come?
I saw only the helmsman imprisoned in his glass-windowed pilot-house. Seated on the ledge furnished by the hull of the skiff, I inhaled the sea's salty aroma with great pleasure. Little by little, the mists were dispersed under the action of the sun's rays. The radiant orb cleared the eastern horizon. Under its gaze, the sea caught on fire like a trail of gunpowder. Scattered on high, the clouds were colored in bright, wonderfully shaded hues, and numerous ladyfingers warned of day-long winds. But what were mere winds to this Nautilus, which no storms could intimidate? So I was marveling at this delightful sunrise, so life-giving and cheerful, when I heard someone climbing onto the platform. I was prepared to greet Captain Nemo, but it was his chief officer who appeared, whom I had already met during our first visit with the captain. He advanced over the platform, not seeming to notice my presence. A powerful spyglass to his eye, he scrutinized every point of the horizon with the utmost care. Then, his examination over, he approached the hatch and pronounced a phrase whose exact wording follows below. I remember it because, every morning, it was repeated under the same circumstances. It ran like this: Nautron respok lorniverch. What it meant I was unable to say. These words pronounced, the chief officer went below again. I thought the Nautilus was about to resume its underwater navigating. So I went down the hatch and back through the gangways to my stateroom. 5 days passed in this way with no change in our situation. Every morning I climbed onto the platform. The same phrase was pronounced by the same individual. Captain Nemo did not appear. I was pursuing the policy that we had seen the last of him, when on November 16th, while re-entering my stateroom with Ned and Conseil, I found a note addressed to me on the table. I opened it impatiently. It was written in a script that was clear and neat but a bit Old English in style, its characters reminding me of German calligraphy. The note was worded as follows: Professor Aronnax aboard the Nautilus, November 16, 1867. Captain Nemo invites Professor Aronnax on a hunting trip that will take place tomorrow morning in his Crespo Island forests. He hopes nothing will prevent the professor from attending, and he looks forward with pleasure to the professor's companions joining him. Captain Nemo, commander of the Nautilus. A hunting trip? Ned exclaimed. And in his forests on Crespo Island? Conseil added. But does this mean the old boy goes ashore? Ned Land went on. That seems to be the gist of it, I said, rereading the letter. Well, we've got to accept, the Canadian answered. Once we're on solid ground, we'll figure out a course of action. Besides, it wouldn't pain me to eat a couple slices of fresh venison. Without trying to reconcile the contradictions between Captain Nemo's professed horror of continents or islands and his invitation to go hunting in a forest, I was content to reply, first let's look into this Crespo Island. I consulted the world map, and in latitude 32 degrees 40 minutes north and longitude 167 degrees 50 minutes west, I found an islet that had been discovered in 1801 by Captain Crespo, which old Spanish charts called Roca de la Plata, in other words, Silver Rock. So we were about 1,800 miles from our starting point, and by a slight change of heading, the Nautilus was bringing us back toward the southeast. I showed my companions this small, stray rock in the middle of the North Pacific. If Captain Nemo does sometimes go ashore, I told them, at least he only picks desert islands. Ned Land shook his head without replying, then he and Conseil left me. After supper was served me by the mute and emotionless steward, I fell asleep, but not without some anxieties. When I woke up the next day, November 17th, I sensed that the Nautilus was completely motionless. I dressed hurriedly and entered the main lounge. Captain Nemo was there waiting for me. He stood up, bowed, and asked if it suited me to come alone. Since he made no allusion to his absence the past 8 days, I also refrained from mentioning it, and I simply answered that my companions and I were ready to go with him. Only, sir, I added, I'll take the liberty of addressing a question to you. Address away, Professor Aronnax, and if I'm able to answer, I will. Well then, Captain, how is it that you've severed all ties with the shore, yet you own forests on Crespo Island? Professor, the captain answered me, these forests of mine don't bask in the heat and light of the sun. They aren't frequented by lions, tigers, panthers, or other quadrupeds. They're known only to me. They grow only for me. These forests aren't on land, they're actual underwater forests. Underwater forests? I exclaimed. Yes, Professor. And you're offering to take me to them? Precisely. On foot? Without getting your feet wet. While hunting? While hunting. Rifles in hand? Rifles in hand. I stared at the Nautilus's commander with an air anything but flattering to the man. Assuredly, I said to myself, he's contracted some mental illness. He's had a fit that's lasted 8 days and isn't over even yet. What a shame. I liked him better eccentric than insane. These thoughts were clearly readable on my face, but Captain Nemo remained content with inviting me to follow him, and I did so like a man resigned to the worst. We arrived at the dining room, where we found breakfast served. Professor Aronnax, the captain told me, I beg you to share my breakfast without formality. We can chat while we eat. Because, although I promised you a stroll in my forests, I made no pledge to arrange for your encountering a restaurant there. Accordingly, eat your breakfast like a man who'll probably eat dinner only when it's extremely late. I did justice to this meal. It was made up of various fish and some slices of sea cucumber, that praiseworthy zoophyte, all garnished with such highly appetizing seaweed as the Porphyra laciniata and the Laurencia prima fetida. Our beverage consisted of clear water to which, following the captain's example, I added some drops of a fermented liquor extracted by the Kamchatka process from the seaweed known by name as Rhodymenia palmata.
At first Captain Nemo ate without pronouncing a single word.
Then he told me, "Professor, when I proposed that you go hunting in my Crespo forests, you thought I was contradicting myself.
When I informed you that it was an issue of underwater forests, you thought I'd gone insane. Professor, you must never make snap judgments about your fellow man."
"But, Captain, believe me, kindly listen to me, and you'll see if you have grounds for accusing me of insanity or self-contradiction."
"I'm all attention."
"Professor, you know as well as I do that a man can live underwater so long as he carries with him his own supply of breathable air. For underwater work projects, the workman wears a waterproof suit with his head imprisoned in a metal capsule, while he receives air from above by means of force pumps and flow regulators."
"That's the standard equipment for a diving suit," I said.
"Correct, but under such conditions the man has no freedom.
He's attached to a pump that sends him air through an India rubber hose. It's an actual chain that fetters him to the shore, and if we were to be bound in this way to the Nautilus, we couldn't go far either."
"Then how do you break free?"
I asked.
"We used the Recuerol device, invented by two of your fellow countrymen but refined by me for my own special uses, thereby enabling you to risk these new physiological conditions without suffering any organic disorders. It consists of a tank built from heavy sheet iron in which I store air under a pressure of 50 atmospheres. This tank is fastened to the back by means of straps, like a soldier's knapsack. Its top part forms a box where the air is regulated by a bellows mechanism and can be released only at its proper tension. In the Recuerol device that has been in general use, two India rubber hoses leave this box and feed to a kind of tent that imprisons the operator's nose and mouth. One hose is for the entrance of air to be inhaled, the other for the exit of air to be exhaled, and the tongue closes off the former or the latter depending on the breather's needs. But in my case, since I face considerable pressures at the bottom of the sea, I needed to enclose my head in a copper sphere, like those found on standard diving suits, and the two hoses for inhalation and exhalation now feed to that sphere." "That's perfect, Captain Nemo, but the air you carry must be quickly depleted, and once it contains no more than 15% oxygen, it becomes unfit for breathing." "Surely, but as I told you, Professor Aronnax, the Nautilus's pumps enable me to store air under considerable pressure, and given this circumstance, the tank on my diving equipment can supply breathable air for 9 or 10 hours. "I've no more objections to raise," I replied.
"I'll only ask you, Captain, how can you light your way at the bottom of the ocean?" "With the Ruhmkorff device, Professor Aronnax. If the first is carried on the back, the second is fastened to the belt.
It consists of a Bunsen battery that I activate not with potassium dichromate but with sodium. An induction coil gathers the electricity generated and directs it to a specially designed lantern. In this lantern one finds a glass spiral that contains only a residue of carbon dioxide gas. When the device is operating, this gas becomes luminous and gives off a continuous whitish light.
Thus provided for, I breathe and I see."
"Captain Nemo, to my every objection you give such crushing answers, I'm afraid to entertain a single doubt. However, though I have no choice but to accept both the Recuerol and Ruhmkorff devices, I'd like to register some reservations about the rifle with which you'll equip me." "But it isn't a rifle that uses gunpowder," the captain replied.
"Then it's an air gun?" "Surely. How can I make gunpowder on my ship when I have no saltpeter, sulfur, or charcoal?"
"Even so," I replied, "to fire underwater in a medium that's 855 times denser than air, you'd have to overcome considerable resistance."
"That doesn't necessarily follow.
There are certain Fulton-style guns perfected by the Englishman Philippe Coles and Burley, the Frenchman Furcy, and the Italian Landi. They're equipped with a special system of airtight fastenings and can fire in underwater conditions. But I repeat, having no gunpowder, I've replaced it with air at high pressure, which is abundantly supplied me by the Nautilus's pumps. But this air must be swiftly depleted."
"Well, in a pinch can't my Recuerol tank supply me with more?"
"All I have to do is draw it from an ad hoc spigot."
E.D.
From Latin, a spigot means just for that purpose. Besides, Professor Aronnax, you'll see for yourself that during these underwater hunting trips, we make no great expenditure of either air or bullets. But it seems to me that in this semi-darkness, amid this liquid that's so dense in comparison to the atmosphere, a gunshot couldn't carry far and would prove fatal only with difficulty. On the contrary, sir, with this rifle every shot is fatal, and as soon as the animal is hit, no matter how lightly, it falls as if struck by lightning."
"Why?" "Because this rifle doesn't shoot ordinary bullets but little glass capsules invented by the Austrian chemist Leniebrock, and I have a considerable supply of them. These glass capsules are covered with a strip of steel and weighted with a lead base. They're genuine little Leyden jars charged with high-voltage electricity.
They go off at the slightest impact, and the animal, no matter how strong, drops dead. I might add that these capsules are no bigger than number 4 shot, and the chamber of any ordinary rifle could hold 10 of them. I'll quit debating, I replied, getting up from the table.
And all that's left is for me to shoulder my rifle.
So where you go, I'll go. Captain Nemo led me to the Nautilus's stern, and passing by Ned and Conseil's cabin, I summoned my 2 companions, who instantly followed us. Then we arrived at a cell located within easy access of the engine room. In this cell we were to get dressed for our stroll.
End of chapter 15. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel. The next chapters are already available on the Jules Verne playlist and at the card at the end of the video.